The jungle is thick, the air is wet, heavy, and alive with the sound of things you cannot see. Somewhere beneath the canopy, beneath the roots of trees that have been growing for centuries, beneath the moss-covered stones of a civilization that once commanded an empire, there is something waiting, something carved from a single piece of quartz crystal, something that should not exist, something that, according to the laws of modern science, could not have been made by the hands that supposedly made it. It is a skull. A human skull, but it is not bone, it is stone, it is crystal, it is perfect, and it is very, very old. This is the story of the crystal skulls of Mesoamerica, objects of beauty, objects of terror, objects that have confounded scientists, enchanted collectors, haunted explorers, and divided the world of archaeology for more than a century. Are they sacred relics of a lost civilization? Are they elaborate forgeries designed to deceive? Are they evidence of technology that existed long before our modern understanding of history allows? Or are they something else entirely, something that sits at the intersection of the known and the unknown, the explainable and the impossible? Welcome. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Now, let us begin. To understand the crystal skulls, you must first understand the world from which they supposedly came. You must understand Mesoamerica, not as a footnote in a textbook, not as a list of dates and kings, but as a living, breathing, extraordinarily sophisticated network of civilizations that rose, flourished, and fell across what we now know as central and southern regions of the Western Hemisphere. These were not primitive peoples scratching symbols into cave walls. These were architects, astronomers, mathematicians, artists, warriors, priests, and philosophers. They built cities that rivaled anything in the ancient world. They charted the movements of the stars with a precision that would not be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. They developed writing systems, calendars, trade networks, and religious cosmologies of staggering complexity. And they did all of this, as far as we know, without the wheel, without iron tools, and without the kind of technology that we, in our modern arrogance, consider essential to civilization. The Maya were perhaps the most intellectually advanced of these Mesoamerican civilizations. Emerging as early as 2,000 years before the Common Era, the Maya built sprawling city-states across the Yucatan Peninsula, the highlands of what is now Guatemala, and the lowlands stretching into modern-day Honduras and Belize. Cities like Tikal, Palenque, Capan, and Calakmul were not mere settlements. They were monumental urban centers with towering pyramids, elaborate palace complexes, underground water systems, and plazas that could hold tens of thousands of people. The Maya developed the most sophisticated writing system in the pre-Columbian world, a fully phonetic script that could express anything the spoken language could. They created a calendar system so accurate that it tracked the solar year to within seconds of our modern measurement. They understood the concept of 0 centuries before it appeared in European mathematics. They predicted eclipses, tracked the orbit of Venus, and built their temples in precise alignment with celestial events. And then there were the Aztecs, latecomers to the Mesoamerican stage. The Aztecs, or more accurately the Mexica, rose to power in the 14th and 15th centuries of the Common Era. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, built on an island in the middle of a vast lake, was one of the largest and most magnificent cities on Earth at the time of its zenith. With a population estimated at over 200,000, larger than any city in Europe at that time, Tenochtitlan was a marvel of engineering. Causeways connected the island to the mainland. Aqueducts brought fresh water from mountain springs. Floating gardens called chinampas produced food in abundance. The great temple at the city's heart rose in terrace steps to a height that dominated the skyline, its summit stained with the blood of sacrificial offerings. The Aztecs were fierce, disciplined, and deeply religious. Their world was governed by a cosmology in which the continuation of the universe itself depended on human sacrifice. The sun needed blood to rise, the rain needed blood to fall, the gods needed blood to survive, and so blood was given, in quantities that horrified even the battle-hardened soldiers of the European conquest. Between and around these two great civilizations were dozens of others. The Olmec, often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, who carved colossal stone heads and may have invented the region's first writing and calendar systems. The Zapotec, who built the mountaintop city of Monte Alban and developed one of the earliest writing systems in the Western Hemisphere. The Mixtec, master goldsmiths and codex painters. The Toltec, whose legendary capital of Tula was remembered by the Aztecs as a golden age of art and learning. The Totonac, the Huastec. The Tarascan, each of these civilizations contributed to the vast, interconnected tapestry of Mesoamerican culture, and each of them in their own way revered the skull. The skull, the image of death, was not feared in Mesoamerica the way it was feared in many other cultures. It was honored, it was worshipped, it was displayed. The Tzompantli, or skull rack, was a common feature of Mesoamerican ceremonial centers. These were wooden racks upon which the skulls of sacrificial victims and fallen warriors were threaded on horizontal poles and displayed publicly. In the Aztec capital, the great skull rack near the Templo Mayor held thousands of skulls. Some estimates suggest tens of thousands, but these were not trophies of cruelty. They were sacred objects. They were offerings to the gods. They were proof that the community had fulfilled its cosmic obligation. They were reminders that death was not an ending but a transformation. In the Mesoamerican worldview, the dead did not simply vanish. They traveled to other realms. They became part of the cosmic cycle. They fed the gods who fed the world. Death was essential to life. The skull was the symbol of that essential truth. This reverence for the skull extended into every aspect of Mesoamerican art and religion. Skulls appeared on temple facades, on pottery, on jewelry, on textiles, on codices, and on the bodies of priests and warriors. The god Mictlantecuhtli, lord of the Aztec underworld, was depicted as a skeletal figure, often with a skull for a head, his eye sockets staring emptily from painted manuscripts and carved stone reliefs. The Maya had their own death gods, Apuch, Sizin, and others, who were similarly skeletal in appearance. Skull imagery was ubiquitous. It was not macabre. It was sacred, and so when crystal skulls began to appear in the collections of European museums and private collectors in the 19th century, they seemed on the surface to fit perfectly into this cultural context. Of course, the Maya or the Aztecs would have carved skulls from crystal. Of course, they would have devoted their finest craftsmanship to rendering the image of death in the purest, most luminous stone they could find. It made sense. It was logical. It was beautiful. But there was a problem, several problems in fact, and those problems would grow larger, more complex, and more contentious with every passing decade. Because the crystal skulls, as it turned out, were not as simple as they appeared. Nothing about them was simple, not their origin, not their age, not their craftsmanship, not even the material from which they were made. Let us talk about quartz crystal. Quartz is one of the most abundant minerals on Earth. It is found on every continent, in virtually every geological environment. It is a silicate mineral, silicon dioxide to be precise, and it forms in hexagonal crystals that can range in size from microscopic grains to enormous formations weighing many tons. Quartz comes in many varieties. Amethyst is purple quartz, citrine is yellow quartz, rose quartz is pink, smoky quartz is gray or brown. And clear quartz, the variety from which the crystal skulls are carved, is colorless, transparent, and extraordinarily beautiful. When polished, clear quartz has a glass-like brilliance that catches and refracts light in mesmerizing ways. It is hard, a 7 on the Mohs scale of mineral hardness, which means it is harder than steel. It is durable. It is resistant to chemical weathering. And it has a number of unusual physical properties that have made it valuable to both ancient and modern civilizations. Quartz is piezoelectric, meaning it generates an electrical charge when subjected to mechanical pressure. This property is used in modern electronics. Quartz crystals are the oscillating hearts of watches, clocks, radios, computers, and countless other devices. Quartz is also pyroelectric, meaning it generates a charge when heated or cooled. And quartz has the ability to vibrate at extremely precise frequencies when an electrical current is applied to it. These properties have led many people, both within and outside the scientific mainstream, to speculate that ancient peoples may have understood and utilized the unique characteristics of quartz crystal in ways that we have not yet fully appreciated. In Mesoamerica, quartz crystal was highly valued. The Maya in particular prized clear quartz as a material for ritual objects. Crystal was associated with clarity, vision, and divine light. Maya shamans and priests used polished crystals as divination tools, as seeing stones through which they could communicate with the spirit world, peer into the future, or diagnose illness. The Aztecs, too, used crystal in their religious practices. Obsidian, a volcanic glass closely related to quartz, was the preferred material for sacrificial knives, mirrors, and other ritual implements. But clear quartz occupied a special place. It was rarer than obsidian, it was harder to work, and it was believed to possess spiritual power, a kind of frozen light, a solidified essence of the divine. So the idea that ancient Mesoamerican craftsmen would have carved skulls from quartz crystal is not in itself implausible. Small crystal skulls an inch or two in length have been found in verified archaeological contexts. They exist, they are real, they are undeniably ancient. The problem arises when we move from the small to the large, because the crystal skulls that have captured the world's imagination are not small. They are life-sized, they are anatomically detailed. And their level of craftsmanship is, according to many experts, beyond what should have been possible with the tools and techniques available to pre-Columbian civilizations. The most famous crystal skull in the world has a name. It is called the Mitchell-Hedges skull, and its story is one of the most extraordinary and most controversial tales in the history of archaeology. To understand this skull, you must first understand the man whose name it bears. Frederick Albert Mitchell-Hedges was born in 1882 in England. He was, by all accounts, a man of enormous energy, boundless ambition, and a flair for the dramatic that would have been remarkable even in an age of remarkable adventurers. He was an explorer, a writer, a gambler, a self-promoter, and depending on whom you ask, either a genuine discoverer of lost civilizations or one of the most audacious frauds in the history of exploration. Mitchell-Hedges claimed to have traveled extensively throughout Central America in the early decades of the 20th century. He claimed to have discovered lost cities in the jungles of Honduras and Belize. He claimed to have fought alongside rebels during various political upheavals. He claimed to have caught record-breaking fish, survived encounters with deadly snakes, and faced down hostile indigenous groups. Many of these claims are difficult to verify. Some are almost certainly exaggerated. A few may be outright fabrications, but there is no question that Mitchell-Hedges did spend considerable time in Central America, and there is no question that he brought back from those journeys one of the most remarkable objects ever to emerge from the Mesoamerican world. The Mitchell-Hedges crystal skull is a life-sized representation of a human skull, carved from a single piece of clear quartz crystal. It weighs approximately 11 pounds and 7 ounces. It is approximately 5 inches high, 7 inches long, and 5 inches wide. The lower jaw is a separate piece, also carved from quartz crystal, that fits precisely into sockets on the main cranium and can be moved up and down, giving the skull the appearance of being able to open and close its mouth. The level of anatomical detail is extraordinary. The zygomatic arches, the cheekbones, are accurately rendered. The temporal bones are correctly shaped. The eye sockets are deep and slightly angled. The teeth are individually carved. The cranial sutures, the lines where the bones of a real skull meet and fuse, are present but subtle, as they would be on the skull of a mature adult. When light is directed into the skull from below, the eye sockets glow. The entire skull seems to come alive with an internal luminescence that is both beautiful and deeply unsettling. It is, by any measure, a masterpiece of lapidary art. And it is the source of one of the greatest mysteries and one of the greatest arguments in the history of archaeology. The story of how the Mitchell-Hedges skull was found has been told many times, and it has changed in the telling. The most commonly repeated version comes from Anna Mitchell-Hedges, Frederick's adopted daughter, who claimed to have discovered the skull on her 17th birthday, January 1, 1924, while exploring the ruins of Lubantun, a Maya city in what is now Belize. According to Anna's account, she was climbing to the top of a partially collapsed pyramid at Lubantan when she noticed something glinting in the rubble below. She called out to her father and the other members of the expedition. Workers were brought in to carefully excavate the area, and there, nestled among the fallen stones of a Maya temple, was the crystal skull, or rather the top of the crystal skull. The detachable jaw was found separately some distance away several months later. It is a wonderful story. It is romantic, dramatic, and perfectly suited to the kind of adventure narrative that Mitchell-Hedges loved to tell. There is only one problem: it may not be true. The first and most glaring issue is that Mitchell-Hedges himself never mentioned the skull's discovery at Lubantan in any of his contemporary writings. His diaries from the expedition, his letters, his newspaper articles, none of them mention finding a crystal skull. This is remarkable, given that Mitchell-Hedges was a man who never missed an opportunity for self-promotion. If he had truly discovered a life-sized crystal skull in a Maya ruin, it would have been the crowning achievement of his career. He would have written about it, he would have talked about it, he would have used it to secure funding for future expeditions, but he did not. The skull does not appear in the public record until 1943, nearly 20 years after it was supposedly found, and the circumstances of its appearance in 1943 raise even more questions. In 1943, the crystal skull appeared at an auction at Sotheby's in London. It was listed as a life-size crystal skull and was purchased by Mitchell-Hedges himself for £400. The seller was a London art dealer named Sidney Burney, who had apparently owned the skull since at least the mid-1930s. This fact that Mitchell-Hedges bought the skull at auction, rather than discovering it in a jungle ruin, is extremely well documented. The Sotheby's records are clear and unambiguous. Mitchell-Hedges bought the skull from Sidney Burney in 1943. So how did Mitchell-Hedges explain this? He claimed that Burney had the skull because Mitchell-Hedges had left it with him as collateral for a loan. Burney, he said, had put it up for auction without his permission, and Mitchell-Hedges had been forced to buy back his own property. It is a plausible explanation, but it is unverified. And it raises the obvious question: if Mitchell-Hedges found the skull in 1924, why is there no mention of it before 1943? Why did he leave such a valuable and extraordinary object with an art dealer for years? And why did the story of its discovery at Lubantan only begin to be told after Mitchell-Hedges had already purchased the skull at auction? These questions have never been satisfactorily answered. And they have led many researchers to conclude that the Mitchell-Hedges skull was not discovered at Lubantan at all. Some believe that Mitchell-Hedges acquired it from a European dealer or collector and invented the Lubantan discovery story to enhance both his reputation and the skull's value. Others believe that the skull may indeed have come from Mesoamerica at some point in its history, but that its association with Lubantan specifically is a fabrication. Still others believe Anna Mitchell-Hedges' account completely and dismiss the Sotheby's auction as an irrelevant detail, a misunderstanding or a deliberate attempt by the establishment to discredit her father's discovery. Anna Mitchell-Hedges maintained her version of events until her death in 2007 at the age of 100. She never wavered, she never changed her story. And she never allowed the skull to be subjected to the kind of rigorous scientific testing that might have settled the question once and for all. She did permit some examinations over the years, but she always retained control of the process, and the results were always controversial. The most significant early examination of the Mitchell-Hedges skull was conducted in 1970 by Frank Dorland, an art conservator and crystal expert. Dorland studied the skull for 6 years and reached a number of remarkable conclusions. He stated that the skull had been carved from a single piece of natural quartz crystal, not synthetic or reconstructed crystal, but a single, flawless piece of natural stone. He noted that the skull showed no evidence of having been carved with metal tools. There were no scratch marks, no tool marks, no signs of the kind of abrasion that would result from the use of metal implements. Dorland speculated that the skull might have been roughly shaped by rubbing it against harder stones, perhaps diamonds, and then finished by hand polishing with sand and water over an extraordinarily long period of time. He estimated that using such methods, the skull would have taken 300 years to complete. 300 years of patient, painstaking, generation after generation labor devoted to a single object. Dorland also noted several anomalous features. When the skull was placed on a light source, the eye socket seemed to glow with a brilliant fire. This, he determined, was due to the careful shaping of the skull's interior. The base of the skull had been carved into a kind of lens or prism that collected light and channeled it upward through the eye sockets. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate design feature, engineered with a sophisticated understanding of optics. Dorland also reported that the skull seemed to produce unusual effects in certain conditions, that it sometimes appeared to change color, that it seemed to emit a faint humming sound, that people who spent extended time in its presence reported headaches, strange dreams, or altered states of consciousness. These reports were anecdotal and unverified, but they added to the skull's mystique and cemented its reputation as something more than a mere carving. In 1970, Dorland arranged for the skull to be examined at the Hewlett-Packard Laboratories in Santa Clara, California. Hewlett-Packard was, at the time, one of the leading manufacturers of quartz crystal oscillators and had extensive expertise in the analysis of quartz. The Hewlett-Packard team subjected the skull to a series of tests and reached several important conclusions. First, they confirmed that the skull was indeed carved from a single piece of natural quartz crystal. The crystal was of the variety known as piezoelectric quartz, the same type used in electronic oscillators. Second, they found that the skull had been carved against the natural axis of the crystal. This was significant because quartz crystal has a natural grain, much like wood, and carving against this grain would normally cause the crystal to shatter. The fact that the skull had been carved against the grain without shattering suggested either extraordinary skill, extraordinary patience, or extraordinary luck, or some combination of all three. Third, the Hewlett-Packard team reported that they could find no evidence of tool marks on the skull's surface. Under magnification, the surface appeared to have been polished rather than carved, as if the skull had been shaped by abrasion and then smoothed to a mirror finish. The Hewlett-Packard examination has been cited by crystal skull enthusiasts for decades as proof that the skull could not have been made with modern technology, let alone ancient technology. This claim is an exaggeration of what the Hewlett-Packard team actually said. What they said was that they could not determine how the skull had been made, not that it could not have been made with modern tools. The distinction is important. But the Hewlett-Packard findings did raise legitimate questions about the skull's manufacture, and those questions have never been fully resolved. The Mitchell-Hedges skull is the most famous crystal skull, but it is far from the only one. There are in fact dozens of crystal skulls in existence, scattered across museums, private collections, and according to some accounts, hidden locations around the world. Some are small, some are large, some are crude, some are exquisite. And their stories, taken together, form a tapestry of mystery, deception, wonder, and fraud that spans more than a century. Let us begin with the skulls that are held in major museums. The British Museum in London possesses a crystal skull that has been in its collection since 1897. This skull is smaller than the Mitchell-Hedges skull, about 6 inches high and less detailed. It does not have a detachable jaw. Its features are more stylized, less anatomically precise. But it is nonetheless an impressive object, carved from a single piece of clear quartz crystal with considerable skill. The British Museum acquired the skull from Tiffany & Company, the famous New York jeweler who had purchased it from a collector. The skull's provenance before Tiffany's is murky. It was said to have come from Mexico, possibly from an Aztec context, but no specific archaeological site was ever identified. For decades, the British Museum displayed the skull as a genuine pre-Columbian artifact, a product of Aztec craftsmanship. Visitors gazed at it with wonder. Guidebooks described it as one of the museum's most remarkable holdings. It was a star attraction. Then in 1996, the British Museum subjected its crystal skull to detailed scientific analysis. The results were devastating, at least for those who believed in the skull's ancient origin. Researchers used electron microscopy to examine the skull's surface at extreme magnification. What they found was unmistakable. The surface of the skull was covered with tiny, parallel scratches, the kind of marks left by a rotary wheel or lapidary tool. These marks were consistent with 19th-century European lapidary techniques. They were not consistent with any known pre-Columbian stone-working method. The conclusion was clear. The British Museum skull had been carved with modern tools. It was not an ancient Aztec artifact. It was, in all probability, a 19th-century European creation. But the story does not end there, because the question of who made the skull and why is itself a fascinating tale. The trail leads to a man named Eugène Boban. Boban was a French antiquities dealer who operated in Mexico City during the latter half of the 19th century. He was, by all accounts, a complex figure, part scholar, part adventurer, part con artist. Boban was appointed as the official archaeologist for the French Scientific Commission in Mexico during the brief and disastrous reign of Emperor Maximilian in the 1860s. After Maximilian's fall and execution, Boban remained in Mexico and established himself as one of the premier dealers in pre-Columbian antiquities. He sold artifacts to museums, collectors, and institutions around the world. He was knowledgeable, well-connected, and when it suited him, not overly scrupulous about the authenticity of the objects he sold. Boban appears to be the common link between several of the most famous crystal skulls. The British Museum skull was traced back to a chain of ownership that almost certainly passed through Boban's hands. And the skull held by the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, another life-sized crystal skull, similar in style to the British Museum skull, was directly acquired from Boban's collection. Boban sold the Paris skull to the French Museum in 1878, claiming it was an authentic Aztec artifact. The Paris skull, like the British Museum skull, was later subjected to electron microscopy and found to bear the same telltale marks of modern lapidary tools. So where did Boban get the skulls? The most likely answer points to the workshops of Idar-Oberstein, a small town in Germany that was, during the 19th century, the center of the European lapidary industry. Idar-Oberstein had been a gem-cutting center since the 15th century, but it reached its peak in the 19th century, when the discovery of vast deposits of quartz crystal and agate in Brazil provided an abundance of raw material. The workshops of Idar-Oberstein could produce objects of extraordinary quality and sophistication. They had the tools, the skills, and the raw materials to create life-sized crystal skulls. And they had a market for such objects, the booming trade in pre-Columbian antiquities that was fueled by European and international collectors' insatiable appetite for exotic artifacts from the New World. The theory, then, is this: craftsmen in Idar-Oberstein, working with Brazilian quartz crystal, carved the crystal skulls in the mid to late 19th century. The skulls were then sold to dealers like Boban, who marketed them as genuine pre-Columbian artifacts, complete with fabricated provenance stories linking them to Aztec or Maya temples. The skulls were then sold to museums and collectors at enormous profit. It was a fraud, a sophisticated, well-organized, and remarkably successful fraud, and it may explain the origin of many, if not most, of the crystal skulls in existence today. But does it explain all of them? This is where the story becomes more complicated, because not all crystal skulls are created equal. The British Museum skull and the Paris skull show clear evidence of modern tool marks. Their provenance traces back to Boban and presumably to the workshops of Idar-Oberstein. They are in all probability 19th century fakes, but the Mitchell-Hedges skull is different. It is more detailed, it is more sophisticated, and according to the examinations that have been conducted, it does not show the same tool marks. Now it must be said that the Mitchell-Hedges skull has never been subjected to the same kind of rigorous, independent, peer-reviewed analysis as the British Museum and Paris skulls. Anna Mitchell-Hedges was protective of the skull to the point of paranoia. She rarely allowed it to be examined, and when she did, she imposed conditions that limited the scope of the examination. After her death, the skull passed to her husband, Bill Hamann, who continued to restrict access. So the question of whether the Mitchell-Hedges skull would show evidence of modern tool marks under electron microscopy remains, to this day, unanswered. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The fact that the Mitchell-Hedges skull has not been proven to be a modern fake does not mean it is genuinely ancient. It simply means that the question remains open, and in that open space, speculation has flourished. Let us consider the various theories that have been proposed to explain the crystal skulls. The first and most straightforward theory is the one we have already discussed. The skulls are modern fakes, created in 19th century European workshops and sold as genuine pre-Columbian artifacts. This theory is supported by strong evidence in the case of the British Museum and Paris skulls. It is the position of the mainstream archaeological community, which regards the crystal skulls as products of the Victorian-era antiquities trade, a trade that was rife with forgery, deception, and fraud. According to this view, the skulls are interesting as objects of art and as case studies in the history of fraud, but they have no archaeological significance whatsoever. They are not ancient, they are not Mesoamerican, they are not mysterious, they are simply very good fakes. This theory has the advantage of simplicity and evidence. It explains the tool marks on the British Museum and Paris skulls. It explains the absence of crystal skulls from verified archaeological contexts. No life-sized crystal skull has ever been found in a controlled, scientifically documented excavation. It explains the skull's sudden appearance in the late 19th century, coinciding with the peak of the Victorian antiquities trade. And it explains the skull's connection to known dealers in dubious antiquities, like Eugène Boban. But the theory also has its weaknesses. It does not fully explain the Mitchell-Hedges skull, which appears to be of significantly higher quality than the museum skulls and which has not been shown to bear the same tool marks. It does not explain the small crystal skulls that have been found in verified archaeological contexts. Objects that, while much simpler than the life-sized skulls, do demonstrate that Mesoamerican peoples worked with crystal and did carve skull-shaped objects from it. And it does not explain the persistent, centuries-old legends and traditions among indigenous Mesoamerican peoples regarding crystal skulls, traditions that predate the Victorian antiquities trade by hundreds of years. The second theory is that the crystal skulls are genuine pre-Columbian artifacts, that they were carved by Maya, Aztec, Mixtec, or other Mesoamerican craftsmen using techniques that we do not fully understand. This theory takes seriously the skill and ingenuity of ancient Mesoamerican artisans, who were capable of working jade, obsidian, and other hard stones with remarkable precision. If they could carve jade, a stone of comparable hardness to quartz, into intricate figurines, masks, and jewelry, then perhaps they could also have carved quartz crystal into skulls. The process would have been extraordinarily laborious. It would have required generations of work. It would have been a monumental act of devotion and craftsmanship. But it was not, in principle, impossible. Proponents of this theory point to the cultural context we discussed earlier, the Mesoamerican reverence for skulls, the use of crystal in religious rituals, the importance of death symbolism in Maya and Aztec religion. They argue that a life-sized crystal skull would have been the ultimate sacred object, a fusion of the most powerful symbol, the skull, with the most sacred material, crystal, in a form that embodied the very essence of Mesoamerican spiritual belief. Such an object would have been the crown jewel of a temple or palace. It would have been guarded, venerated, and perhaps hidden from the Spanish conquistadors who systematically destroyed Mesoamerican religious artifacts during the conquest. This theory is romantic and culturally respectful, but it faces serious evidentiary challenges. No life-sized crystal skull has ever been found in a controlled archaeological excavation. The skulls that have been scientifically tested show evidence of modern tool marks, and the provenance of every major crystal skull is, at best, uncertain and, at worst, demonstrably fabricated. The third theory ventures into more speculative territory. It proposes that the crystal skulls are not merely ancient but impossibly ancient. that they predate the Maya and the Aztecs, that they were created by a civilization that existed before recorded history, a civilization that possessed technology equal to or superior to our own. This theory draws on the broader tradition of alternative archaeology, which proposes that human civilization is far older and far more advanced than mainstream scholars believe. Proponents of this view point to various anomalies and mysteries around the world: the precision of the Great Pyramids, the engineering marvels of ancient megalithic sites, the sophisticated astronomical knowledge of ancient peoples, as evidence of a lost, advanced civilization that was destroyed by a cataclysm thousands of years ago. In this framework, the crystal skulls are not Mesoamerican at all. They are relics of this lost civilization, perhaps Atlantis, perhaps some other forgotten culture that were preserved and passed down through the ages, eventually coming into the possession of the Maya or the Aztecs, who revered them as sacred objects without understanding the technology that created them. The skulls, according to this theory, may have served as data storage devices, crystalline computers, in effect, that encoded vast amounts of information in their molecular structure. The piezoelectric properties of quartz crystal, which are exploited in modern electronics, may have been deliberately harnessed by this lost civilization to create objects that could store and transmit knowledge across millennia. This theory is, to put it mildly, not supported by mainstream science. There is no credible evidence for the existence of a prehistorical advanced civilization. The crystal skulls that have been tested show evidence of 19th century manufacture, not impossibly ancient origins. And the idea that quartz crystal can be used as a data storage device, while technically plausible in certain very specific and very modern contexts, has no application to a carved skull. A crystal skull is not a computer. It is not a hard drive. It is a piece of carved stone. The fact that quartz has interesting electrical properties does not mean that a quartz skull is an ancient database, but the theory persists. It persists because it taps into something deep in the human psyche, a longing for mystery, for hidden knowledge, for the possibility that the world is more wonderful and more strange than the dry facts of mainstream science allow. And it persists because the crystal skulls themselves are genuinely strange and genuinely beautiful objects that seem, in their perfection and their luminosity, to belong to another world. The fourth theory is perhaps the most provocative of all. It proposes that the crystal skulls are not of this earth, that they were brought here by extraterrestrial visitors, that they are gifts or warnings or tools or weapons left behind by beings from another planet who visited Mesoamerica in the distant past. This theory is part of the broader ancient astronaut hypothesis, which proposes that extraterrestrial beings visited Earth in antiquity and influenced the development of human civilization. Proponents of this view point to the crystal skulls as evidence of technology that could not have been produced by any terrestrial civilization, ancient or modern. The perfection of the carving, the absence of tool marks, the optical properties of the skulls, the legends of supernatural power, all of these, according to the ancient astronaut theorists, point to an origin beyond our planet. It should be noted that the ancient astronaut hypothesis is not taken seriously by any mainstream scientist, archaeologist, or historian. It is considered pseudoscience, a collection of unfounded speculations, misinterpreted evidence, and outright fabrications. The crystal skulls do not require an extraterrestrial explanation. They can be explained, and in most cases have been explained, by perfectly terrestrial processes: 19th century European lapidary work, Victorian-era antiquities fraud, and the human appetite for mystery and wonder. But the theory endures. It is featured in books, television shows, and films. It has become part of the popular mythology of the crystal skulls. And while it has no scientific basis, it does serve a purpose. It keeps the crystal skulls in the public consciousness, it generates interest and discussion, and it reminds us that, for all our knowledge and technology, we still live in a world full of things we do not fully understand. Now let us return to the skulls themselves. Let us look at them one by one, examining their histories, their characteristics, and the controversies that surround them. We have already discussed the Mitchell-Hedges skull in some detail. Let us now turn to some of the other major crystal skulls. The British Museum skull, which we mentioned earlier, is sometimes called the Aztec skull or the Bernese skull. It entered the museum's collection in 1897 and was displayed as a genuine Aztec artifact for nearly a century. It is a single piece of cloudy quartz crystal, about 6 inches high, with a hole drilled vertically through it from top to bottom. This hole has been interpreted as evidence that the skull was meant to be mounted on a staff or pole, perhaps as a kind of ceremonial scepter. The skull's features are crudely rendered compared to the Mitchell-Hedges skull. The eyes are simple hollows. The teeth are suggested rather than individually carved. The overall impression is of a stylized representation rather than an anatomically accurate portrait. As we discussed, electron microscopy revealed that the skull's surface bears the marks of a rotary lapidary wheel, a tool that was not used in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, but was standard equipment in 19th-century European workshops. The Paris skull, held by the Musée du Quai Branly, is similar in style and quality to the British Museum skull. It is slightly smaller, about 4 inches high, and is carved from a cloudy quartz crystal. Like the British Museum skull, it has a hole drilled through it from top to bottom, and like the British Museum skull, it shows evidence of rotary tool marks under electron microscopy. The Paris skull was acquired directly from Eugène Boban in 1878, and Boban claimed it was a genuine Aztec artifact. Modern analysis has shown this claim to be false. Then there is the skull known as Max. Max is a large crystal skull, about 40 pounds in weight, that is claimed to have been passed from a Guatemalan shaman to a Tibetan monk and eventually to a family in Texas who named it Max. The skull is carved from a single piece of clear quartz crystal and is of considerable size, though its anatomical detail is less precise than that of the Mitchell-Hedges skull. Max has never been subjected to rigorous scientific analysis, and its provenance is entirely based on oral tradition and the claims of its owners. There is no documentary evidence to support the story of its origins, and no way to verify the chain of ownership that supposedly links it to a Guatemalan shaman. Another skull of note is the one known as Sha Na Ra. This skull was reportedly discovered in Mexico in 1995 by a man named Nick Nosrino, who claimed to be a crystal skull researcher. Nosrino said he found the skull during an expedition to an unspecified location in Mexico, guided by psychic visions. The skull is carved from clear quartz and is of moderate size. Like Max, it has never been subjected to rigorous independent analysis, and its provenance is based entirely on the claims of its discoverer. There is also the so-called Smithsonian skull, a large crystal skull that was anonymously donated to the Smithsonian Institution in 1992. This skull is one of the largest known crystal skulls, weighing approximately 31 pounds. It was accompanied by a note claiming that it was an Aztec artifact that had been purchased in Mexico in 1960. The Smithsonian subjected the skull to detailed analysis and concluded that it was almost certainly a modern creation. The skull was found to contain tiny bubbles of water trapped within the crystal, a feature that is common in natural quartz, but that can also be used to help determine the origin of the crystal. More significantly, the skull's surface showed evidence of modern carving tools, including what appeared to be marks from a carborundum-based abrasive, a synthetic material that was not available before the 20th century. The Smithsonian concluded that the skull was a fake and placed it in storage rather than on display. Each of these skulls has its own story, its own legend, its own community of believers and skeptics, and each of them, in its own way, illustrates the fundamental tension at the heart of the crystal skull phenomenon, the tension between what we want to believe and what the evidence actually shows. Let us now consider a question that is rarely asked, but that is in many ways the most important question of all. Why do people believe in the crystal skulls? The answer is not simple because belief is never simple. People believe in the crystal skulls for many different reasons. Some believe because they have a genuine spiritual experience in the presence of a skull, a feeling of peace or energy or connection to something larger than themselves. These experiences are real even if their cause is debatable. The human brain is extraordinarily sensitive to suggestion, to environment, to expectation. Place a person in a dimly lit room, hand them an object that they have been told is thousands of years old and possessed of mysterious power, and it would be surprising if they did not feel something. This does not mean the experience is fake. It means the experience is human. Some believe because they distrust mainstream science and mainstream archaeology. They see the crystal skulls as evidence that the establishment is hiding something, that the true history of humanity is being suppressed, that ancient civilizations were far more advanced than we are told, that the truth is out there somewhere, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to look. This distrust of authority is not irrational. Mainstream science has been wrong before, sometimes spectacularly so. The history of science is full of examples of established experts dismissing evidence that later turned out to be correct. But the fact that science has been wrong in the past does not mean that any particular alternative theory is right. And in the case of the crystal skulls, the alternative theories face a formidable body of contrary evidence. Some believe because the crystal skulls are simply beautiful. They are objects of extraordinary aesthetic power. To hold a crystal skull in your hands, or even to see one behind glass in a museum, is to experience something genuinely moving. The play of light through the crystal, the luminous transparency, the eerie perfection of the carved features, these things speak to something deep in the human soul. We are drawn to beauty, we are drawn to mystery, and the crystal skulls offer both in abundance. And some believe because the idea of the crystal skulls connects them to Mesoamerican cultures that they admire and respect. The Maya and the Aztecs were extraordinary civilizations, and the crystal skulls, whether real or fake, serve as a kind of tribute to their greatness. To believe in the crystal skulls is to believe in the genius of ancient peoples, to credit them with achievements that modern science says were impossible, to honor their memory by insisting that they were capable of wonders that we can barely imagine. This impulse is understandable, even admirable, but it can also be misleading. Because the real achievements of the Maya and the Aztecs, their mathematics, their astronomy, their architecture, their art, their writing, their agriculture, their social organization, are more impressive than any crystal skull. The Maya did not need to carve a life-sized skull from quartz crystal to prove their genius. They proved it every day in 1,000 different ways for 2,000 years. Let us now turn to a different aspect of the crystal skull phenomenon, the legends. Long before the crystal skulls became objects of scientific controversy, they were objects of legend. And those legends, while difficult to verify, add a rich layer of narrative to the story. The most pervasive legend is the legend of the 13 skulls. According to this tradition, which is attributed to various indigenous Mesoamerican sources, though its actual origin is difficult to pin down, there are 13 crystal skulls in existence. These 13 skulls were created by an ancient civilization. Some versions say the Maya, some say the Aztecs, some say a civilization that predates both, and they were distributed across the world. When all 13 skulls are brought together in one place, something extraordinary will happen. What that something is varies depending on who is telling the story. Some versions say that the skulls will reveal the secret history of humanity. Some say they will unlock the mysteries of the universe. Some say they will prevent a global catastrophe. Some say they will bring about a new age of enlightenment, peace, and spiritual evolution. The legend of the 13 skulls is a powerful and appealing narrative. It has the structure of a quest. The heroes must find the scattered skulls and bring them together before it is too late. It has the promise of revelation. The skulls contain knowledge that will change everything. And it has the urgency of a deadline. The skulls must be assembled before a specific date or event, or the opportunity will be lost forever. It is, in short, the perfect mythological story, and it is told with conviction and passion by crystal skull enthusiasts around the world. But where does the legend come from? This is a surprisingly difficult question to answer. Crystal skull proponents often claim that the legend is rooted in ancient Maya or Aztec tradition. But when researchers have looked for the source of this claim, they have found it difficult to locate. The legend does not appear in any known pre-Columbian codex or inscription. It is not mentioned in the accounts of the Spanish conquistadors, who were generally thorough in documenting Mesoamerican religious beliefs, especially those that could be used to justify the destruction of indigenous culture. It is not found in the extensive ethnographic literature on Maya and Aztec religion compiled by 19th and 20th century anthropologists. The earliest documented version of the legend appears to date from the 1980s, when it was popularized by crystal skull enthusiasts and New Age authors. Some researchers have suggested that the legend may have been invented wholesale, a modern myth dressed in ancient clothing to lend credibility to the crystal skull phenomenon. Others have suggested that it may be based on a genuine indigenous oral tradition that was never written down and that has been embellished and transformed in the retelling. The truth is that we simply do not know. The legend of the 13 skulls exists in a gray zone between history and mythology, between fact and fiction, between ancient tradition and modern invention. There are, however, genuine indigenous beliefs about crystals and crystal skulls that are worth exploring. Among various Maya communities in Guatemala and southern Mexico, crystal objects have long been associated with spiritual power. Crystals are used in healing rituals, in divination, and in communication with the spirit world. Maya daykeepers, the traditional calendar priests who maintain the ancient 260-day ritual calendar, sometimes use crystals as tools for reading the future and interpreting the will of the gods. These practices are not specifically about crystal skulls, but they do establish a cultural context in which crystal objects were revered and believed to possess supernatural properties. The Aztecs, too, had traditions involving crystals and skulls. The god Tezcatlipoca, smoking mirror, was associated with obsidian mirrors that were used for divination and sorcery. While obsidian is technically a different material than quartz crystal, both are forms of silica and both were used in ritual contexts. The Aztecs also carved human skulls from various materials, including jade, flint, and bone. The skull was one of the 20-day signs in the Aztec calendar. It was associated with death, transformation, and spiritual power. The idea of a skull carved from the most luminous and powerful stone available, clear quartz crystal, fits naturally within this cultural framework. Among the Tarascan people of western Mexico, there are traditions of crystal objects being used in religious ceremonies. Among the Huical people of the Sierra Madre, crystals are believed to be the solidified tears of the gods, and they play an important role in healing and visionary rituals. Among various Pueblo peoples of the southwestern regions, quartz crystals are used by healers and shamans for diagnosis and treatment of illness. These traditions do not prove that life-sized crystal skulls are genuine pre-Columbian artifacts, but they do demonstrate that the reverence for crystal objects and the association of crystal with spiritual power is deeply rooted in indigenous Mesoamerican and broader indigenous culture. The crystal skull phenomenon did not emerge from a cultural vacuum. It grew out of a rich and complex tradition of crystal use and crystal veneration that has ancient roots. Let us now examine the physical properties of the crystal skulls more closely, because whether they are ancient or modern, genuine or fake, the crystal skulls are remarkable objects from a purely material standpoint. Clear quartz crystal is a fascinating substance. It is composed of silicon dioxide, the same compound that makes up ordinary sand. But whereas sand is an aggregate of tiny, randomly oriented grains, quartz crystal is a highly ordered structure in which silicon and oxygen atoms are arranged in a precise, repeating lattice. This internal order gives quartz crystal its distinctive properties, its hardness, its transparency, its ability to refract light, and its piezoelectric and pyroelectric qualities. The quartz used in the crystal skulls is of exceptionally high quality. It is clear or nearly clear with few inclusions or flaws. This kind of optical grade quartz is relatively rare. Most natural quartz contains impurities, traces of iron, aluminum, lithium, or other elements that give it color or cloudiness. Finding a piece of clear quartz large enough to carve a life-sized skull from a single block would be difficult even today, when quartz mining is a well-established industry. In the 19th century, when the crystal skulls were most likely carved, the main source of large, high-quality quartz crystals was Brazil, where enormous deposits of clear quartz had been discovered in the interior of the country. Carving a life-sized skull from a block of quartz crystal is an extraordinarily challenging task. Quartz is hard, harder than most metals, harder than glass, harder than any stone commonly used for carving. It cannot be cut with ordinary tools. It requires abrasives of equal or greater hardness, diamond, corundum, or in modern times synthetic materials like carborundum. Even with appropriate abrasives, the process is slow, tedious, and fraught with risk. Quartz is brittle. A miscalculated blow or an unexpected flaw in the crystal can cause the entire piece to fracture irreparably. Carving a skull with the anatomical detail of the Mitchell-Hedges skull, with its individual teeth, its precisely shaped eye sockets, its accurately rendered cheekbones and temporal bones, would require not only skill but also patience measured in years, if not decades. And then there is the polishing. The crystal skulls are polished to a mirror-like finish that allows light to pass through them with minimal distortion. Achieving this level of polish on quartz crystal requires progressively finer abrasives, applied with careful, consistent pressure over long periods of time. Each stage of polishing removes the scratches left by the previous stage, gradually smoothing the surface to an optical grade finish. This process is time-consuming even with modern equipment. Without modern equipment, without rotary tools, without synthetic abrasives, without electric motors, it would be almost inconceivably laborious. This is the crux of the argument made by those who believe the skulls are genuinely ancient. If the skulls were made without modern tools, if they were shaped by hand, using stone-on-stone abrasion and natural abrasives like sand, then the amount of labor required would be staggering. It would represent a monumental commitment of time, skill, and resources. It would be, in a very real sense, a devotional act, a sacred labor undertaken not for profit or display, but for spiritual purposes. And this, the believers argue, is exactly what we would expect from a Mesoamerican civilization that devoted generations of labor to building pyramids, carving jade masks, and painting elaborate murals in underground tombs. The skeptics counter that this argument, while emotionally appealing, ignores the evidence. The tool marks on the British Museum and Paris skulls demonstrate conclusively that at least some crystal skulls were made with modern tools. The absence of crystal skulls from verified archaeological contexts suggests that life-sized crystal skulls were not, in fact, produced by pre-Columbian civilizations. And the skull's appearance on the antiquities market in the late 19th century, at the height of the Victorian craze for exotic artifacts, points strongly to a modern origin. The debate continues, and perhaps it will never be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Because the crystal skulls occupy a unique position at the intersection of science, history, art, and belief, they are objects that mean different things to different people. To a scientist, they are specimens to be analyzed, tested, and categorized. To a historian, they are clues to be investigated, placed in context, and interpreted. To an artist, they are masterworks to be admired. To a believer, they are sacred objects to be revered. And to a skeptic, they are cautionary tales about the human capacity for self-deception. Let us now turn our attention to the broader context in which the crystal skulls emerged as objects of fascination, because the story of the crystal skulls is not just a story about archaeology or art or fraud. It is also a story about the age in which they came to prominence, the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the cultural forces that made them so captivating. The late 19th century was a time of extraordinary change. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the economies and societies of Europe and beyond. New technologies, the telegraph, the railroad, the steamship, had shrunk the world and made it possible to travel to places that had previously been inaccessible. The age of European colonialism was at its height, and vast regions of the globe were being explored, mapped, exploited, and all too often plundered by agents of colonial powers. In this context, the discovery of ancient civilizations and the acquisition of their artifacts took on enormous cultural significance. Museums in London, Paris, Berlin, and elsewhere competed fiercely for the most impressive collections of ancient objects. Private collectors, many of them fabulously wealthy industrialists, sought to fill their mansions with exotic antiquities, and a thriving market in forged and misattributed artifacts grew up to meet the demand. Mesoamerica was a particularly fertile ground for this market. The Maya and Aztec civilizations had been known to Europeans since the Spanish conquest of the 16th century, but it was not until the 19th century that systematic exploration and excavation of their ruins began. The pioneering explorations of John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherwood in the 1840s, documented in lavishly illustrated books that became international bestsellers, introduced the European and international public to the wonders of Maya architecture. Suddenly, the ancient Maya were fashionable, their art was admired, their writing was studied, their ruins were visited by increasing numbers of travelers, and their artifacts were eagerly sought by collectors and museums. But the supply of genuine artifacts was limited. Controlled excavation was rare. Most artifacts that reached the international market came from unauthorized digging, looting, or outright fabrication. Dealers like Eugène Boban operated in a largely unregulated environment, where provenance was a matter of the dealer's word and authentication was more art than science. In such an environment, a skilled forger could produce objects that even knowledgeable experts would accept as genuine. And crystal skulls, exotic, beautiful, and seemingly consistent with known Mesoamerican artistic traditions, were ideal products for this market. The Victorian fascination with death also played a role. The late 19th century was obsessed with mortality. The high rates of infant and child mortality, the devastating epidemics of cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis, the massive casualties of wars, both colonial and continental, all of these contributed to a culture in which death was omnipresent and inescapable. The Victorians developed elaborate rituals and customs around death and mourning. They built grand cemeteries, they wore black for extended periods, they photographed their dead. They collected memento mori, objects that served as reminders of death and the transience of life. Skulls were a classic memento mori, and a skull carved from luminous crystal was the ultimate expression of this tradition. It combined the reminder of death with the beauty and permanence of crystal, a material that, unlike bone, would never decay, never crumble, never return to dust. The crystal skull was death perfected, death purified, death made eternal. It is no wonder that the Victorians were fascinated by them, and then there was the spiritualist movement. The late 19th century saw an explosion of interest in spiritualism, the belief that the living could communicate with the dead through mediums, seances, and various forms of divination. Spiritualism attracted millions of followers, including prominent scientists, writers, and public figures. Crystal balls, dowsing rods, Ouija boards, and other devices were used by spiritualists to facilitate communication with the spirit world. Crystal, in particular, was believed to have special properties that made it a conduit for spiritual energy. The crystal skull, with its combination of crystal and skull imagery, was a natural object of fascination for spiritualists. It seemed to embody the intersection of the material and the spiritual, a physical object that served as a gateway to the realm of the dead. It was in this cultural context, this heady mix of colonial exploration, archaeological discovery, antiquities fraud, death obsession, and spiritual seeking, that the crystal skulls first captured the public imagination. And once captured, that imagination has never let go. Let us now consider the role of the crystal skulls in popular culture. Because the influence of the crystal skulls extends far beyond the worlds of archaeology and the paranormal, the crystal skulls have become icons of popular culture, symbols of mystery, adventure, and the unknown that have appeared in novels, films, television shows, video games, and countless other media. The crystal skulls have been featured in adventure fiction since the early 20th century. The image of the intrepid explorer discovering a glowing crystal skull in a lost jungle temple is one of the most enduring tropes of the adventure genre. It combines several powerful narrative elements: the thrill of discovery, the allure of the exotic, the danger of the unknown, and the promise of supernatural power. These elements have made the crystal skulls irresistible to storytellers. Television documentaries have explored the crystal skulls from every conceivable angle. Some have taken a skeptical approach, examining the evidence for fraud and concluding that the skulls are modern creations. Others have taken a more credulous approach, presenting the skulls as genuine mysteries that defy conventional explanation. Still others have adopted a hybrid approach, presenting both sides of the argument and leaving the viewer to draw their own conclusions. These documentaries have been enormously popular, drawing millions of viewers and generating widespread public interest in the crystal skulls. The crystal skulls have also found a home in the New Age movement. Since the 1980s, crystal skulls have been embraced by New Age practitioners as tools for healing, meditation, and spiritual development. Thousands of small crystal skulls are carved and sold every year, marketed as objects of spiritual power. Crystal skull workshops, retreats, and conferences are held regularly around the world. Crystal skull guardians, people who claim to have been chosen to care for specific skulls, form communities and networks that span the globe. For these people, the crystal skulls are not curiosities or controversies. They are sacred objects, channels for divine energy, links to a wisdom that transcends time and space. The New Age crystal skull movement has its critics, both within and outside the scientific community. Scientists dismiss the claims of crystal skull enthusiasts as unsupported by evidence. Some indigenous Mesoamerican leaders have expressed discomfort with the appropriation of their cultural symbols by New Age practitioners, arguing that the crystal skull phenomenon trivializes and distorts genuine indigenous spiritual traditions. And some skeptics have pointed out that the New Age crystal skull market is a lucrative industry, with individual skulls selling for thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars, and have questioned whether the spiritual claims are sincere or merely a marketing strategy. These criticisms have merit, but they do not tell the whole story, because the people who are drawn to crystal skulls are not, for the most part, gullible fools or cynical profiteers. They are, by and large, sincere seekers, people who are looking for meaning, connection, and transcendence in a world that often seems to offer none of these things. The crystal skulls for them are not just objects, they are symbols, they are portals, they are reminders that the universe is vast and mysterious and full of wonders that we have not yet begun to understand. And in a strange way, this is the most important thing about the crystal skulls, not whether they are ancient or modern. Not whether they are genuine or fake, not whether they are Maya or Aztec or German or extraterrestrial. The most important thing about the crystal skulls is what they reveal about us, about our longing for mystery, our hunger for the past, our need to believe that there is more to the world than what we can see and touch and measure. The crystal skulls are mirrors, and in their luminous, transparent depths we see ourselves. Let us now return to the archaeology, because there is still much to discuss. We have talked about the major crystal skulls, the Mitchell-Hedges skull, the British Museum skull, the Paris skull, Max, Sha Na Ra, the Smithsonian skull. But there are others, many others, and each of them adds a piece to the puzzle. In the 1990s, a wave of interest in crystal skulls led to a proliferation of new skulls on the market. Some were openly marketed as modern carvings, decorative objects made in workshops in Brazil, China, Germany, and elsewhere. These skulls made no claim to ancient origin. They were art objects, pure and simple, and they were sold as such. But others were marketed with elaborate provenance stories, claims of discovery in remote jungle ruins, claims of transmission through unbroken lineages of indigenous shamans, claims of psychic or spiritual authentication. These claims were in most cases impossible to verify. And the sheer number of crystal skulls on the market, estimates range from several hundred to several thousand, made it clear that the vast majority of them were modern creations, whatever their sellers might claim. But the existence of modern fakes does not necessarily disprove the existence of genuine ancient skulls. This is an important logical point that is often overlooked in the debate. The fact that many crystal skulls are modern forgeries does not mean that all crystal skulls are modern forgeries. It is theoretically possible that a few genuine ancient skulls exist among the many fakes. The problem is distinguishing the genuine from the false, and that problem is compounded by the fact that the owners of the most famous skulls have consistently resisted the kind of rigorous, independent testing that might settle the question. Let us talk about what modern science can tell us about the crystal skulls. The tools available to researchers today are far more sophisticated than anything that existed when the skulls first came to public attention. Electron microscopy can reveal surface details invisible to the naked eye, the telltale marks of specific tools and techniques. X-ray diffraction can determine the crystallographic structure of the quartz and identify its geological origin. Chemical analysis can detect trace elements and inclusions that may indicate where the quartz was mined. And thermoluminescence dating, while not directly applicable to quartz in the same way it is to ceramics, can provide indirect evidence about the history of an object. The electron microscopy studies conducted on the British Museum and Paris skulls in the 1990s and 2000s were groundbreaking. The researchers, led by Margaret Sachs at the British Museum and Ian Freestone at Cardiff University, used scanning electron microscopy to examine the skull's surfaces at magnifications of up to several thousand times. What they found was dramatic. The surfaces of both skulls were covered with tiny, regular, parallel scratches, the kind of marks produced by a rotating wheel coated with an abrasive material. These marks were consistent with the use of a jeweler's wheel, a standard tool in 19th-century European lapidary workshops. They were not consistent with any known pre-Columbian stone-working technique. The researchers also found evidence that the skulls had been polished with a material that left a smooth, regular finish quite different from what would be expected from hand polishing with natural abrasives. The researchers went further. They compared the tool marks on the crystal skulls with tool marks on objects of known 19th-century European manufacture and with tool marks on objects of known pre-Columbian origin. The results were unambiguous. The crystal skulls' tool marks matched the European objects. They did not match the pre-Columbian objects. The conclusion was clear and devastating. The British Museum and Paris skulls were carved with 19th-century European tools. They were not ancient Mesoamerican artifacts, they were modern fakes. These findings were published in peer-reviewed scientific journals and were widely reported in the popular press. They dealt a severe blow to the credibility of the crystal skull phenomenon, but they did not end the debate, because the Mitchell-Hedges skull, the most famous and most impressive of all the crystal skulls, was not included in the study. Its owners refused to allow it to be tested. And without data on the Mitchell-Hedges skull, the question of whether any crystal skull is genuinely ancient remains technically open. This is frustrating for scientists. It is also frustrating for many crystal skull enthusiasts who would like definitive proof that their beloved objects are genuine, but it is the reality of the situation. The Mitchell-Hedges skull remains untested by modern standards, and until it is tested, its status will remain uncertain. Let us now consider the question of motivation. Why would someone create a fake crystal skull? What would they have to gain? The answer in the 19th century was simple: money. The market for pre-Columbian antiquities was booming. Museums and collectors were willing to pay large sums for impressive artifacts, and a life-sized crystal skull, exotic, beautiful, and apparently consistent with known Mesoamerican artistic traditions, would command a very high price. The economics of fraud were compelling. A skilled lapidary craftsman in Idar-Oberstein could carve a crystal skull from a piece of Brazilian quartz in a matter of months. The raw material was relatively inexpensive. The labor, while skilled, was not exorbitant, and the finished product could be sold for many times its production cost, especially if it was accompanied by a convincing provenance story linking it to an ancient Maya or Aztec temple. Eugène Boban, the French antiquities dealer who is linked to several of the most famous crystal skulls, was well positioned to facilitate this kind of fraud. He had extensive contacts in both the European lapidary industry and the Mesoamerican antiquities market. He had the knowledge to create plausible provenance stories. He had the reputation and connections to sell objects to major museums and serious collectors. And he had a demonstrated willingness to stretch the truth when it suited his purposes. Whether Boban was the mastermind of the crystal skull fraud or merely one link in a chain of deception is not entirely clear, but his role in the story is central and well documented. But money is not the only motivation for creating a fake crystal skull. There is also the motivation of fame. Frederick Mitchell-Hedges, whatever the truth of his skull's origin, used it to enhance his reputation as an explorer and adventurer. The skull made him famous, it made him interesting, it gave him a story that no one else could tell. And in the competitive world of early 20th century exploration, where reputations were made and broken by the sensationalism of one's discoveries, a crystal skull found in a Maya ruin was worth its weight in gold, not just in monetary terms, but in terms of celebrity and prestige. And there is the motivation of belief. Some people create or promote fake crystal skulls not for money or fame, but because they genuinely believe in the skull's spiritual power. They see themselves not as fraudsters, but as custodians of a sacred tradition. They believe that the skulls are conduits for divine energy, regardless of when or where they were made. For these people, the question of whether a skull is genuine, in the archaeological sense, is irrelevant. What matters is whether the skull works, whether it facilitates healing, meditation, communication with the spirit world, or spiritual growth. And by that standard, a skull carved in a Brazilian workshop last year is just as real as a skull carved in a Maya temple 1,000 years ago. This perspective is difficult for scientists and historians to accept. It challenges the fundamental premise that authenticity is determined by age and origin. But it is a perspective that is held sincerely by many people, and it deserves to be understood, even if it cannot be endorsed by the standards of empirical inquiry. Let us now consider one more aspect of the crystal skull story before we pause: the role of indigenous voices. For much of the Crystal Skull saga, indigenous Mesoamerican peoples have been talked about but rarely talked to. The skulls have been attributed to the Maya, the Aztecs, and other indigenous civilizations, but the actual views of these civilizations' descendants have been largely ignored. This is a significant oversight because the descendants of the Maya and the Aztecs are not extinct. They are alive, they have opinions, and those opinions are worth hearing. In recent decades, some indigenous leaders and scholars have spoken out about the crystal skulls. Their views are varied and nuanced. Some regard the crystal skull phenomenon with amusement, seeing it as yet another example of outsiders projecting their fantasies onto indigenous cultures. Some regard it with annoyance, seeing it as a distortion and trivialization of genuine indigenous spiritual traditions. Some regard it with interest, seeing it as a reflection of the enduring power of indigenous cultural symbols. And some regard it with reverence, seeing the crystal skulls, whether ancient or modern, as objects that embody genuine spiritual truth. Maya elder Hunbat's Men, a daykeeper from the Yucatan, has spoken publicly about the crystal skulls, suggesting that they are connected to ancient Maya wisdom and that they carry energies that can be beneficial to humanity. Other Maya leaders have been more skeptical, pointing out that the crystal skull phenomenon is largely a creation of non-indigenous people and that it has little to do with actual Maya spiritual practice. The diversity of indigenous opinion on this subject reflects the diversity of indigenous communities themselves, communities that are not monolithic but complex, varied, and internally debated. What is clear is that the crystal skull phenomenon cannot be fully understood without taking indigenous perspectives into account. The skulls, whether real or fake, are connected to indigenous cultures, and those cultures have a right to be heard in the conversation about them. The tendency to treat indigenous peoples as historical artifacts, as ancient, vanished civilizations rather than living, evolving communities, is itself a form of distortion, and it is a distortion that the crystal skull phenomenon, with its emphasis on the ancient and the mysterious, has sometimes reinforced. As we approach the end of this first part of our exploration, let us pause to take stock of what we have learned. We have learned that the crystal skulls of Mesoamerica are a complex and multifaceted phenomenon. They are objects of art, objects of fraud, objects of faith, and objects of science. They are connected to some of the most remarkable civilizations in human history, civilizations that achieved extraordinary things without the tools and technologies that we take for granted. They are connected to one of the most turbulent and transformative periods in the history of the modern world, the age of colonial exploration and exploitation. And they are connected to enduring human needs, the need for beauty, the need for mystery, the need for meaning, and the need to believe that there is more to the world than meets the eye. We have learned that the evidence strongly suggests that many, if not most, of the known crystal skulls are modern creations, products of 19th-century European workshops, carved with modern tools from Brazilian quartz and sold as ancient Mesoamerican artifacts by unscrupulous dealers. This conclusion is supported by detailed scientific analysis, by the skull's documented provenance, and by the broader context of the Victorian antiquities trade. But we have also learned that the question is not entirely settled. The Mitchell-Hedges skull, the most famous and most impressive of all the crystal skulls, has never been subjected to the kind of rigorous testing that has debunked the others. Its origin remains uncertain, its craftsmanship remains unexplained, and its power to fascinate remains undiminished. We have learned that the crystal skulls exist at the intersection of many different worlds, the world of science and the world of faith, the world of history and the world of legend, the world of the museum and the world of the marketplace. They are Rorschach tests in crystal objects that reflect the beliefs, desires, and assumptions of those who gaze into them. And we have learned that the story of the crystal skulls is, ultimately, a story about us, about our relationship with the past, about our longing for the mysterious, about our willingness to believe and our reluctance to be deceived, about the thin line that separates wonder from credulity and skepticism from cynicism. This is a story that is not over. It is a story that continues to unfold as new skulls are discovered or created, and as new techniques of analysis become available. It is a story that will continue to be told, retold, and debated for generations to come. Because as long as the crystal skulls exist, sitting in their museum cases and private collections, glowing with their eerie inner light, staring at us with their empty, luminous eyes, they will continue to ask us the question that they have always asked. What do you see? What do you see when you look into the crystal? Do you see the genius of ancient craftsmen? Do you see the chicanery of Victorian fraudsters? Do you see the wisdom of the ancients? Do you see the folly of modern believers? Do you see a mirror? Do you see a window? Do you see a door? The crystal skulls do not answer. They never answer. They only stare. And in their silence, they invite us to keep looking, keep questioning, keep wondering. We have covered much ground in this first part of our journey. We have explored the civilizations of Mesoamerica, the Maya, the Aztecs, and the many other peoples who built one of the most remarkable cultural traditions in human history. We have examined the role of the skull in Mesoamerican art and religion. We have discussed the properties of quartz crystal and its significance in both ancient and modern contexts. We have told the stories of the most famous crystal skulls, the Mitchell-Hedges skull, the British Museum skull, the Paris skull, and others. We have examined the evidence for and against the skull's authenticity. We have explored the various theories that have been proposed to explain them. We have considered the cultural and historical context in which they emerged, and we have reflected on what the crystal skulls reveal about the human condition. But there is much more to tell. In the second part of our exploration, we will delve deeper into the science of the crystal skulls. We will examine the latest research and the newest analytical techniques. We will explore the world of crystal skull collectors and believers in greater detail. We will investigate the connections between the crystal skulls and other mysterious artifacts and unexplained phenomena. We will consider the skull's relationship to the broader traditions of Mesoamerican spirituality and shamanism. We will examine the ethical questions raised by the crystal skull phenomenon, questions about cultural appropriation, about the trade in antiquities, about the responsibility of museums and scholars to the public and to indigenous communities. And we will attempt to reach some conclusions, tentative, provisional, and always open to revision, about what the crystal skulls are, what they mean, and why they matter. The jungle is still thick, the air is still wet and heavy, and somewhere beneath the canopy, beneath the roots and the moss and the fallen stones of empires, the crystal skulls are waiting. They have been waiting for a long time. They are patient, they are luminous, they are silent, and they have more secrets to share. This concludes Part 1. Part 2 continues our exploration into the depths of this extraordinary mystery, the crystal skulls of Mesoamerica. We return now to the crystal skulls. We return to the silence of quartz. We return to the empty eye sockets that have stared out at the world for decades or centuries or millennia, depending on whom you believe. We return to the mystery because the mystery is not finished. It is far from finished. The surface has been scratched, yes, but quartz is hard, harder than steel. Harder than iron, and the truth, if there is a truth buried somewhere inside these luminous stones, is harder still. In the first part of our journey, we laid the foundation. We walked through the jungles of Mesoamerica. We stood in the shadow of pyramids. We examined the great civilizations, the Maya, the Aztecs, the Olmec, and the many others who built, worshipped, fought, dreamed, and died across this extraordinary landscape. We told the stories of the most famous crystal skulls. We weighed the evidence. We considered the theories, and we arrived at a place of profound uncertainty, a place where the known and the unknown meet, where science and legend intersect, where the provable and the unprovable sit side by side, staring at each other across a gap that may never be fully bridged. Now we go deeper. Let us begin with the ruins. Not the ruins in the abstract, not the ruins as symbols or metaphors, but the actual, physical, moss-covered, tree-strangled ruins of the places where crystal skulls are said to have been found, because the stones have stories to tell, and those stories, if we listen carefully enough, may help us understand what is real and what is not. Lubantan. The name means place of fallen stones in the modern Maya language, and it is an apt description. The site lies in the Toledo district of what is now Belize, in the foothills of the Maya Mountains, surrounded by dense tropical forest. It was a Maya city of moderate size, occupied primarily during the late Classic period, roughly the 7th through the 10th centuries of the Common Era. Unlike many Maya cities, which were built with limestone blocks held together by lime mortar, Lubantan was constructed using a distinctive technique. Large blocks of stone were carefully shaped and fitted together without mortar, in a style reminiscent of Inca masonry in South America. The city's main features include several large plazas, a ball court, and a series of stepped platforms that may have served as the bases for temples or elite residences. Lubantan was first documented by the colonial administrator Thomas Gann in 1903, and it was subsequently visited by several other researchers. But it was Frederick Mitchell-Hedges who brought the site to international attention in the 1920s. Mitchell-Hedges organized a series of expeditions to Lubantan between 1924 and 1927, funded in part by wealthy sponsors and accompanied by considerable publicity. It was during these expeditions that his adopted daughter Anna supposedly discovered the crystal skull. Now, the archaeological record of Lubantan is important for what it does and does not contain. Excavations at the site have produced a variety of artifacts, pottery, figurines, obsidian blades, jade ornaments, and other objects consistent with a late classic Maya urban center. But no crystal skull has ever been documented in the site's archaeological record by any professional archaeologist. The only account of a crystal skull being found at Lubantan comes from Anna Mitchell-Hedges herself, and that account, as we discussed in Part 1, is unsupported by contemporary documentation and contradicted by the Sotheby's auction records of 1943. It is worth noting that Mitchell-Hedges' expeditions to Luban were not conducted according to the standards of professional archaeology, even by the standards of the 1920s. Mitchell-Hedges was not a trained archaeologist. He was an adventurer and a publicist. His excavation methods were crude by any standard. He did not keep detailed field notes. He did not systematically record the location and context of the objects he found. He did not publish his findings in professional journals. In short, his work at Luban was more spectacle than science, and this makes it impossible to evaluate his claims, including the claim that a crystal skull was found there, on the basis of archaeological evidence. The professional archaeologists who have worked at Luban since Mitchell-Hedges' time have found no evidence to support the crystal skull story. Norman Hammond, who conducted extensive excavations at the site in the 1970s and 1980s, found no crystal skull, no fragment of a crystal skull, and no reference to a crystal skull in the oral traditions of the local Maya communities. Hammond has stated publicly that he believes the Mitchell-Hedges skull was not found at Luban and that the story of its discovery there is a fabrication. But let us for a moment set aside the question of whether the Mitchell-Hedges skull was found at Luban and consider a broader question. Could a crystal skull have been made by the ancient Maya? Is it physically possible, given what we know about Maya technology, for Maya craftsmen to have carved a life-sized skull from quartz crystal? The answer is, it depends on what you mean by possible. The Maya were extraordinary stone workers. This is not a matter of speculation or romanticism. It is an established archaeological fact. The Maya carved limestone, sandstone, and volcanic tuff into architectural blocks, stele, altars, and elaborate sculptural programs. They carved jade, a stone that is roughly comparable in hardness to quartz, into figurines, masks, pendants, ear spools, and other objects of astonishing beauty and precision. They worked obsidian into razor-sharp blades, mirrors, and ritual implements. They carved bone, shell, and wood. They were, in short, master craftsmen who could shape almost any material into almost any form. The key technology that the Maya used for working hard stones like jade was abrasion. They did not have metal tools hard enough to cut jade or quartz. Instead, they used harder materials, primarily chert, and in some cases, harder varieties of quartz, as abrasives. They would shape a piece of jade or other hard stone by rubbing it against an abrasive surface, or by using an abrasive paste, a mixture of fine stone dust and water, to grind away material. For drilling, they used tubular drills made from bird bones or hollow reeds, combined with an abrasive paste. For cutting, they used string or cord saws, again combined with abrasive paste. These techniques were slow, laborious, and required enormous patience, but they were effective. And the results, the jade masks of Palenque, the jade plaques of Tikal, the jade figurines of Capan, are proof that the Maya could achieve extraordinary results with these simple tools. Could these same techniques have been used to carve a life-sized skull from quartz crystal? In principle, yes. Quartz is slightly harder than jade on the Mohs scale, 7 compared to jade's 6 to 6.5, but the difference is not insurmountable. The techniques that work on jade, abrasion, grinding, drilling, polishing, would also work on quartz, albeit more slowly and with greater difficulty. The main challenge would not be the hardness of the material, but the brittleness. Quartz is more brittle than jade. It is more prone to fracturing along unexpected planes. A misplaced blow, an uneven pressure, a hidden flaw in the crystal, any of these could destroy months or years of work in an instant. Carving a life-sized skull from quartz crystal using abrasive techniques would require not only skill, but also a profound understanding of the material, its internal structure, its stress points, its tendencies, its quirks. It would require, in a word, mastery, and it would require time, an enormous amount of time. Frank Dorland's estimate of 300 years for the Mitchell-Hedges skull may be an exaggeration. Dorland was not a professional archaeologist, and his methods of estimation were not rigorous, but even a more conservative estimate would place the work at decades, if not generations. Carving a life-sized skull from quartz crystal without metal tools, without rotary machinery, without synthetic abrasives, using only stone, sand, water, and human patience would be one of the most extraordinary feats of craftsmanship in human history. It would be comparable to the carving of the great Maya stele, the construction of the pyramids, or the painting of the Sistine Chapel. It would be a monument of human dedication and skill. Is it impossible? No. Is it improbable? That depends on your assumptions about what ancient peoples were capable of and willing to do. If you believe, as many mainstream archaeologists do, that such a project would have been impractical given the demands of daily life in a Maya city-state, then yes, it is improbable. If you believe, as some alternative researchers argue, that the Maya were capable of feats of patience and craftsmanship that exceed our modern expectations, then it becomes more plausible. The question is not really about technology. It is about willpower, motivation, and the cultural context that would have made such a project meaningful. And this brings us to a crucial point. If the Maya or any other Mesoamerican people did carve a life-sized crystal skull, they would have done so for a reason, not as a decorative object, not as a curiosity, not as a collector's item. They would have done so as an act of devotion, a sacred labor dedicated to the gods, to the dead, to the cosmic forces that governed their world. The skull would have been a ritual object of the highest order. It would have been housed in the most sacred precinct of the most important temple. It would have been attended by priests, guarded by warriors, and venerated by the entire community. It would have been, in the truest sense of the word, a treasure, not a treasure of monetary value, but a treasure of spiritual significance, a physical embodiment of the most profound beliefs of the civilization that created it. If such an object existed, what would have happened to it when the Maya civilization declined? The Maya did not vanish overnight. The great classic period cities, Tikal, Palenque, Kapan, Calakmul, were abandoned over a period of decades, roughly between the 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era. The reasons for this abandonment are still debated: drought, warfare, overpopulation, environmental degradation, social upheaval, political collapse. All of these factors probably played a role, but the Maya people did not disappear. They migrated, they adapted, they built new cities in new locations. And they carried with them the knowledge, the traditions, and presumably the sacred objects of their ancestors. A crystal skull, if it existed, might have been carried from one city to another, from one generation to the next, passing through the hands of priests and kings over centuries. It might have been hidden during times of crisis, buried beneath a temple floor, sealed in a cave, concealed in a secret chamber. It might have survived the Spanish conquest, the catastrophic event that began in the early 16th century and that resulted in the destruction of much of Mesoamerican civilization. The Spanish were thorough in their destruction of indigenous religious objects. They burned codices, they smashed idols, they melted down gold ornaments, they demolished temples, but they did not destroy everything. Some objects were hidden, some were preserved in secret. Some survived, passed down through generations of indigenous families, hidden from the eyes of the colonial authorities. Is it possible that a crystal skull or several crystal skulls survived in this way? It is possible. There is no evidence to prove it, but there is also no evidence to disprove it. The absence of crystal skulls from the archaeological record does not necessarily mean that they never existed. It may mean that they were too important to be left in places where they could be found by archaeologists, that they were deliberately hidden, carefully protected, and passed down through channels that left no paper trail. This is speculation. It is not evidence, but it is the kind of speculation that keeps the crystal skull mystery alive. Because as long as the possibility remains, however remote, that somewhere in some hidden cave or secret chamber or family shrine, a genuinely ancient crystal skull still waits to be discovered, the mystery endures. Let us now turn to a subject that we touched on in Part 1 but did not fully explore: the science of quartz crystal and its relevance to the crystal skull debate. Quartz crystal is, in many ways, one of the most remarkable substances on Earth. We discussed its basic properties earlier: its hardness, its transparency, its piezoelectric nature. but there is much more to say about quartz, and understanding its full range of properties is essential to evaluating the claims that are made about crystal skulls. First, let us talk about the structure of quartz. Quartz belongs to the trigonal crystal system, which means that its atoms are arranged in a three-dimensional lattice with threefold symmetry. Each silicon atom is bonded to 4 oxygen atoms, and each oxygen atom is bonded to 2 silicon atoms, forming a continuous framework of interconnected tetrahedra. This framework is extraordinarily stable, which is why quartz is so hard and so resistant to chemical weathering. It is also why quartz survives in geological environments that destroy most other minerals. Quartz grains in sandstone can be billions of years old. The quartz in a crystal skull, if left undisturbed, would outlast the skull's owner, the owner's civilization, and in all probability the human species itself. The piezoelectric property of quartz is perhaps its most scientifically significant characteristic. When mechanical pressure is applied to a quartz crystal, it generates a small electrical voltage. Conversely, when an electrical voltage is applied to a quartz crystal, it vibrates at a precise and predictable frequency. This property was first discovered by Jacques and Pierre Curie in 1880, and it has since been exploited in countless technological applications. Quartz crystal oscillators are the timing devices in virtually every modern watch, clock, computer, smartphone, and telecommunications system. Without quartz, modern electronics as we know it would not exist. The piezoelectric property of quartz has also fueled much of the speculation about crystal skulls. Some crystal skull enthusiasts have suggested that the skulls might function as piezoelectric devices, that the pressure of holding them or the vibrations of speaking near them might generate electrical fields that could have physiological or psychological effects on human beings. Some have gone further, suggesting that the skulls might be capable of storing and transmitting information through their crystalline structure, functioning in effect as ancient hard drives or data crystals. These claims are, from a scientific standpoint, largely unfounded. While it is true that quartz is piezoelectric, the magnitude of the electrical fields generated by mechanical pressure on a handheld crystal object is extremely small, far too small to have any measurable physiological effect. And while it is theoretically possible to store information in a crystalline lattice, researchers have demonstrated this in laboratory settings using femtosecond laser pulses. This requires technology that is firmly 21st century. The idea that an ancient civilization could have encoded information in a crystal skull is not supported by any known physical mechanism, but the allure of the idea is powerful. The notion that knowledge, ancient wisdom, lost history, cosmic truths might be locked away inside a crystal skull, waiting for the right key to unlock it, is deeply appealing. It connects to age-old traditions of secret knowledge and hidden wisdom. It connects to the modern fascination with data storage and information technology. And it connects to the very real and very remarkable properties of quartz crystal, which, while they do not support the specific claims made about crystal skulls, are nonetheless genuinely amazing. There is another property of quartz that is relevant to the crystal skull discussion: its optical properties. Clear quartz crystal is transparent to a wide range of electromagnetic radiation, including visible light, ultraviolet light, and infrared light. This transparency, combined with quartz's ability to refract and internally reflect light, gives crystal objects their characteristic brilliance and fire. When light enters a crystal skull, it is refracted, reflected, and scattered by the skull's internal surfaces, creating complex patterns of light and shadow that can be strikingly beautiful and, to some observers, eerily lifelike. The Mitchell-Hedges skull is particularly notable for its optical properties. As we discussed in Part 1, the skull's base appears to have been carved into a kind of lens or prism that collects light from below and channels it upward through the eye sockets. This creates the effect of glowing eyes, an effect that is both technically impressive and psychologically powerful. Anyone who has seen the Mitchell-Hedges skull illuminated from below will attest to its uncanny, almost supernatural appearance. The skull seems to come alive. its eye sockets blaze with light. Its features emerge from shadow with a startling clarity. It is easy to understand why people who have spent time in its presence report feeling awe, unease, or a sense of the numinous. But this optical effect, while impressive, is not evidence of supernatural power. It is evidence of skilled craftsmanship. The carver of the Mitchell-Hedges skull, whoever that carver was, understood the optical properties of quartz crystal and deliberately exploited them to create a specific visual effect. This is not magic, it is engineering, it is art, and it is entirely consistent with what a skilled 19th-century lapidary craftsman, or, for that matter, a skilled ancient craftsman, could achieve with sufficient knowledge and patience. Let us now explore an aspect of the crystal skull phenomenon that is often overlooked in scientific discussions: the psychological dimension. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. We are evolved to find meaning in our environment, to see faces in clouds, to hear voices in the wind, to detect intention in random events. This tendency, which psychologists call apophenia, is a fundamental feature of human cognition. It is the reason we see the man in the moon. It is the reason we find shapes in ink blots, and it is one of the reasons why crystal skulls have such a powerful effect on people. A skull is one of the most emotionally charged images in the human visual vocabulary. We are hardwired to respond to faces, and a skull is the face stripped of everything that makes it individual, stripped of skin, muscle, expression, identity, and reduced to its essential, universal form. A skull is every face. A skull is no face. A skull is the face of death itself. And when that skull is rendered in crystal, in a material that is transparent, luminous, and seemingly otherworldly, the emotional impact is magnified enormously. The crystal skull becomes a memento mori of extraordinary power, a reminder of mortality that is simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, intimate and alien, familiar and strange. This psychological impact is not accidental. It is, arguably, the entire point. Whether the crystal skulls were created by ancient Maya priests or 19th-century German craftsmen, their makers understood the power of the skull image. They understood that a crystal skull would provoke a response, a visceral, emotional, almost involuntary response in anyone who saw it. This response is not evidence of supernatural power. It is evidence of the power of art. The crystal skulls are, above all else, works of art. They are designed to move us, to disturb us, to make us feel something, and in this they succeed magnificently. The psychological dimension also helps explain why people report unusual experiences in the presence of crystal skulls: headaches, altered states of consciousness, strange dreams, feelings of energy or warmth. These experiences are real in the sense that the people who report them are genuinely experiencing something, but their cause is more likely psychological than physical. When a person believes that an object has special power, their brain responds accordingly. Expectation shapes perception. Belief creates experience. This is not deception. It is the normal functioning of the human mind, and it is one of the most important factors in understanding the crystal skull phenomenon. This is not to say that the experiences reported by crystal skull enthusiasts are worthless or meaningless. They are not. They are genuine human experiences, and they deserve to be taken seriously as such. But they should not be confused with evidence of supernatural power. The fact that a person feels peaceful or energized in the presence of a crystal skull tells us something important about the human mind. It does not tell us anything about the skull. Now let us turn to a topic that we have not yet addressed in depth: the community of crystal skull enthusiasts. The crystal skull community is a diverse and fascinating subculture. It includes people from all walks of life: scientists, artists, healers, mystics, collectors, adventurers, and ordinary people who are simply drawn to the beauty and mystery of the skulls. It includes believers who are convinced that the skulls are ancient and powerful, skeptics who enjoy the mystery without accepting the supernatural claims, and agnostics who are simply curious and open-minded. The community has its own gatherings, its own publications, its own networks, and its own internal debates. Crystal Skull conferences are held regularly in various locations around the world. These events bring together skull owners, researchers, healers, and enthusiasts for presentations, workshops, and meditations. The atmosphere at these events is typically warm, welcoming, and earnest. People share their experiences with their skulls. They discuss the latest research. They meditate together. Form connections. For many attendees, these gatherings are not just about crystal skulls. They are about community. They are about belonging. They are about finding a group of people who share your interests and your worldview in a world that often dismisses or ridicules those interests. The crystal skull community also has its tensions and controversies. There are disputes about which skulls are real and which are modern. There are disagreements about the proper way to care for and interact with skulls. There are rivalries between skull owners, and there are ongoing debates about the commercialization of the crystal skull phenomenon, the fact that crystal skulls are bought, sold, and marketed as spiritual products, often at very high prices. Some community members view this commercialization with unease, feeling that it cheapens the spiritual significance of the skulls. Others view it as a natural and inevitable part of a growing movement. And still others see it as a legitimate livelihood, a way to share the beauty and power of crystal skulls with a wider audience while also supporting themselves and their families. The modern crystal skull market is substantial. Thousands of crystal skulls are carved and sold every year, ranging in price from a few dollars for a small, mass-produced skull to tens of thousands of dollars for a large, high-quality skull with a compelling provenance story. The main centers of modern crystal skull production are Brazil, where abundant supplies of quartz crystal are available, and China, where skilled and inexpensive labor makes large-scale production economically viable. Some modern skulls are carved from natural quartz crystal. Others are carved from synthetic quartz or from other materials, glass, resin, or reconstituted stone that are marketed as crystal. The existence of this modern market creates obvious challenges for anyone trying to determine the authenticity of a particular skull. With thousands of new skulls entering the market every year, the probability that any given skull is a modern creation is extremely high. And the sophistication of modern carving techniques means that it is increasingly difficult to distinguish a modern skull from an older one on the basis of visual inspection alone. Only detailed scientific analysis, electron microscopy, chemical analysis, crystallographic study can definitively determine whether a skull was carved with modern or pre-modern tools. And even these methods have limitations because a skilled modern craftsman who deliberately avoids rotary tools and uses only traditional techniques could, in principle, create a skull that would pass scientific scrutiny. This is the paradox of the crystal skull phenomenon. The more we learn about how to test the skulls, the more we realize how difficult it is to reach definitive conclusions. Science can tell us a great deal, but it cannot tell us everything. And in the gaps between what science can and cannot tell us, the mystery persists. Let us now explore the connections between the crystal skulls and the broader traditions of Mesoamerican shamanism and spirituality. Because whatever the skull's physical origin, their cultural significance is deeply rooted in a spiritual tradition that stretches back thousands of years. Shamanism is one of the oldest and most widespread forms of spiritual practice in human history. In its broadest definition, shamanism is a practice in which a specially trained or gifted individual, the shaman, enters an altered state of consciousness in order to communicate with the spirit world, heal the sick, divine the future, or perform other spiritual functions. Shamanic practices have been documented in cultures around the world, from Siberia to Australia, from Africa to the Arctic. And Mesoamerica was one of the richest and most complex shamanic traditions anywhere on Earth. In Mesoamerica, shamanic practitioners went by many names. Among the Maya, they were known as H-men or Akin, terms that translate roughly as doer or he of the sun. Among the Aztecs, they were known as Tlamatini, those who know, or by more specific titles depending on their function, Tisitl for healers, Tonalpauqui for diviners, Nahueli for shapeshifters. These practitioners occupied a central role in Mesoamerican society. They were healers, counselors, prophets, and intermediaries between the human world and the world of the gods. Central to Mesoamerican shamanic practice was the use of sacred objects, objects that were believed to possess spiritual power and that served as tools for healing, divination, and communication with the spirit world. These objects included mirrors, especially obsidian mirrors, which were believed to be portals to the spirit world. They included copal incense, which was burned in enormous quantities during rituals and ceremonies. They included cacao, which was consumed as a sacred beverage during religious events. They included hallucinogenic plants and fungi, peyote, morning glory seeds, psilocybin mushrooms, and others that were used to induce the altered states of consciousness necessary for shamanic journeying, and they included crystals. The use of crystals in Mesoamerican shamanic practice is well documented. Maya shamans used polished crystals as sas-tun, stones of light or seeing stones, for divination. The shaman would gaze into the crystal, entering a trance state, and would see visions that revealed the cause of an illness, the location of a lost object, the identity of a sorcerer, or the outcome of a future event. This practice, known broadly as scrying, has parallels in many cultures around the world. The European tradition of crystal ball gazing is perhaps the most familiar example. But in Mesoamerica, the practice was embedded in a complex theological and cosmological framework. The crystal was not merely a tool. It was a link to the spirit world. It was a conduit for divine communication. It was a physical manifestation of the sacred light that illuminated all things. The association between crystals and spiritual vision is deeply embedded in Maya thought. The Maya word for crystal, lem, is related to words meaning flash, mirror, and brilliance. Crystal was understood as solidified light, a physical form of the divine radiance that animated the cosmos. To gaze into a crystal was to gaze into the light of creation itself, and to possess a crystal, especially a large, clear, perfectly formed crystal, was to possess a piece of that light, a fragment of divine power, a tool of extraordinary spiritual significance. In this context, a life-sized crystal skull would have been the ultimate shamanic tool. It would have combined the most powerful spiritual symbol, the skull, the emblem of death and transformation, with the most powerful spiritual material, crystal, the embodiment of divine light. It would have been a scrying device of unparalleled power, a tool for communicating with the dead, for seeing into the future, for understanding the deepest mysteries of the cosmos. It would have been, in a very real sense, an object of ultimate spiritual authority. This cultural context does not prove that the crystal skulls are genuine ancient artifacts, but it does demonstrate that they fit, with remarkable precision, into the spiritual framework of Mesoamerican civilization. The crystal skulls are not random objects. They are not arbitrary creations. They are objects that make sense, deep, resonant, cultural sense, within the tradition from which they supposedly come. Whether they were actually created within that tradition, or whether they were created by modern craftsmen who understood that tradition well enough to exploit it, is the question that remains unanswered. Let us now consider a figure whom we mentioned briefly in Part 1 but who deserves more attention, Eugène Boban, because Boban is, in many ways, the key to understanding the crystal skull phenomenon. He is the spider at the center of the web. And his story is one of the most fascinating and most revealing stories in the entire Crystal Skull saga. Eugène Boban Duverger was born in 1834 in Paris. His father was an antiquarian, and young Eugène grew up surrounded by objects from distant lands and ancient times. As a young man, he traveled to Mexico, where he developed a deep fascination with pre-Columbian civilizations. He learned the Nahuatl language. He studied Mesoamerican archaeology. He became one of the foremost experts on pre-Columbian art and artifacts in the world, and he became one of the most prolific and most controversial dealers in pre-Columbian antiquities. Boban's expertise was genuine. He had a real and deep knowledge of Mesoamerican cultures, and many of the objects he sold to museums and collectors were genuine pre-Columbian artifacts. His collection included pottery, figurines, stone sculptures, jade objects, obsidian tools, and countless other items that he acquired through purchase, excavation, and trade. Some of these objects are now among the most prized holdings of major museums around the world, but Boban also dealt in forgeries, and this is where the story becomes complicated, because the line between genuine and fake in the 19th century antiquities trade was not always clear. Many objects in Boban's inventory occupied a gray zone, objects that were partially genuine and partially restored, objects that were genuine but misattributed, objects that were genuine but of uncertain provenance. In this gray zone, Boban operated with skill and, when necessary, with dishonesty. He was not above inventing a provenance, embellishing a description, or misrepresenting the age or origin of an object if it would increase its value or enhance its appeal to a buyer. The crystal skulls that passed through Boban's hands, including the skulls now in the British Museum and the Musée du Quai Branly, appear to have been part of this gray zone. Boban marketed them as genuine Aztec artifacts, complete with provenance stories that linked them to ancient temples and ritual practices. But the scientific evidence now strongly suggests that these skulls were carved in European workshops, using European tools and European techniques from quartz crystal that most likely came from Brazil. The question is, did Boban know they were fakes? This is a difficult question to answer with certainty. Boban was knowledgeable enough to recognize a genuine pre-Columbian artifact when he saw one. He was also knowledgeable enough to recognize a fake. If the crystal skulls were indeed made in European workshops, it is likely that Boban knew, or at least suspected, that they were not genuine. But it is also possible that Boban was himself deceived, that he purchased the skulls from a supplier who told him they were genuine, and that he passed them on in good faith. The antiquities trade was, and still is, a world of incomplete information, uncertain attributions, and calculated ambiguity. It is not always possible to determine who knew what and when they knew it. What we can say is that Boban's role in the crystal skull story illuminates a larger truth about the antiquities trade, that the desire for exotic and impressive objects creates a market that attracts both genuine artifacts and skilled forgeries, and that the distinction between the two is often blurred, contested, and in some cases irrelevant to the object's cultural impact. The crystal skulls that Boban sold to the British Museum and the Musée du Quai Branly may be 19th century fakes, but they have been displayed, studied, written about, and admired for over a century. They have inspired wonder, curiosity, and debate. They have become cultural artifacts in their own right, objects whose significance transcends their origin. The fact that they are not ancient does not mean they are not important. Now let us turn to a topic that is often discussed in connection with the crystal skulls, but that deserves careful and critical examination: the idea of cursed artifacts. The notion that ancient objects can carry curses, that they can bring misfortune, illness, or death to those who possess or disturb them, is one of the oldest and most persistent ideas in human culture. The most famous example is the so-called curse of Tutankhamun, which supposedly killed several members of Howard Carter's expedition after the opening of the pharaoh's tomb in 1922. This curse, like most alleged archaeological curses, is almost certainly a myth, a product of media sensationalism, selective attention to coincidences, and the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. But the idea of the curse has a powerful grip on the popular imagination, and it has been applied to the crystal skulls as well. Various crystal skull owners and enthusiasts have reported what they believe to be the effects of crystal skull curses. These reports include illness, financial misfortune, relationship problems, accidents, and in a few cases, death. The Mitchell-Hedges skull, in particular, has been associated with stories of misfortune befalling those who disrespect or mishandle it. Anna Mitchell-Hedges reportedly warned visitors to treat the skull with respect, implying that it had the power to punish those who did not. These stories are anecdotal. They are not supported by any systematic evidence, and they are easily explained by ordinary psychological and statistical phenomena. If you tell a person that an object is cursed, and that person subsequently experiences any kind of misfortune, as all people inevitably do, they will tend to attribute that misfortune to the curse. This is a classic example of confirmation bias, paying attention to evidence that confirms your belief while ignoring evidence that contradicts it. The people who touch the crystal skull and subsequently experience good fortune, or no notable fortune at all, are not part of the story. Only the ones who experienced bad fortune make the cut, and so the legend of the curse grows and persists, even in the absence of any genuine evidence. But the idea of the cursed artifact, while not literally true, does point to something genuinely interesting about the human relationship with objects. We invest objects with meaning, we imbue them with power, we treat them as if they have agency, as if they can act on us, influence our lives, shape our destinies. This tendency is not irrational, it is deeply human. It reflects our innate sense that the material world is not merely passive and inert but active and alive, that objects are not just things but participants in the drama of human existence. The crystal skulls, with their combination of beauty, mystery, and the imagery of death, are particularly potent triggers for this kind of projection. They invite us to invest them with power, they invite us to believe. And many of us accept the invitation. Let us now consider the ethical dimensions of the crystal skull phenomenon, because the crystal skulls raise a number of important ethical questions that deserve thoughtful consideration. The first ethical question concerns the trade in antiquities. The market for pre-Columbian artifacts, both genuine and forged, has a long and troubled history. The looting of archaeological sites in Mesoamerica has been a persistent problem for over a century. Looters dig up tombs, temples, and burial sites in search of saleable objects: pottery, jade, gold, stone sculptures, and occasionally crystal. This looting destroys the archaeological context of the objects, the spatial relationships, the associated artifacts, the architectural features that give them meaning and allow them to be properly interpreted. A jade figurine torn from a tomb by a looter is a beautiful object, but it is a mute object, an object that has been stripped of its story. A jade figurine excavated by professional archaeologists, carefully recorded and analyzed in its original context, can tell us volumes about the civilization that created it. The difference between these two objects is not just academic, it is ethical. Looting destroys knowledge. It robs future generations of the opportunity to learn about the past, and it robs indigenous communities of their cultural heritage. The crystal skulls, whether genuine or fake, are connected to this broader problem. If any of the crystal skulls were genuinely looted from archaeological sites, then they are tainted objects, objects whose acquisition involved the destruction of irreplaceable knowledge and the violation of indigenous cultural rights. If they are fakes, objects created in European workshops and sold as genuine antiquities, then they are products of fraud, and their sale contributed to a market that encouraged and incentivized looting. The second ethical question concerns cultural appropriation. The crystal skull phenomenon draws heavily on indigenous Mesoamerican cultural symbols and traditions. The skull imagery, the crystal symbolism, the references to Maya and Aztec cosmology, all of these are drawn from the cultural heritage of living indigenous peoples. When non-indigenous people use these symbols and traditions for their own purposes, whether commercial, spiritual, or recreational, without the knowledge, consent, or involvement of indigenous communities, this raises legitimate questions about appropriation and respect. Some indigenous leaders have spoken out about this issue. They have expressed concern that the crystal skull phenomenon misrepresents and trivializes their cultural traditions. They have pointed out that the legends and practices attributed to their cultures by crystal skull enthusiasts are often distorted, decontextualized, or simply invented. And they have argued that the profits generated by the crystal skull market, the book sales, the conference fees, the skull purchases, flow to non-indigenous people, while indigenous communities see no benefit. These concerns are valid and important. They deserve to be heard and taken seriously by everyone involved in the crystal skull phenomenon: researchers, collectors, enthusiasts, and the general public. The cultural heritage of indigenous Mesoamerican peoples is not a resource to be mined for profit or entertainment. It is a living tradition, maintained and practiced by living people, and it deserves to be treated with respect. The third ethical question concerns the responsibility of museums and scholars. Museums that display crystal skulls, whether as genuine artifacts or as interesting curiosities, have a responsibility to present accurate information about them. For decades, major museums displayed crystal skulls as genuine pre-Columbian artifacts without questioning their provenance or subjecting them to scientific analysis. This failure of diligence contributed to the public's acceptance of the skulls as ancient and genuine, and it lent the authority of respected institutions to claims that were, at best, unverified and at worst, demonstrably false. In recent years, many museums have updated their displays and their narratives about crystal skulls, incorporating the results of scientific analysis and presenting the skulls as objects of uncertain origin rather than as confirmed pre-Columbian artifacts. The British Museum, for example, now displays its crystal skull with a label that acknowledges its probable 19th century origin. This is commendable, but it also raises the question of how much damage was done during the decades when the skull was displayed without such caveats. How many visitors left the museum believing they had seen a genuine Aztec artifact? How many books and articles were written on the assumption that the skull was authentic? How many other fraudulent objects entered collections on the strength of the precedent set by the museum skulls? These questions are not unique to the crystal skulls. They arise in connection with every dubious object in every museum collection. But the crystal skulls, because of their fame and their emotional power, are a particularly vivid illustration of the problem. They remind us that museums are not infallible. They are not neutral arbiters of truth. They are institutions run by human beings, subject to the same biases, assumptions, and errors as any other human enterprise. And they have a responsibility to the public, to scholars, and to the cultures whose heritage they hold to get things right. Now let us consider one of the most intriguing aspects of the crystal skull phenomenon, the relationship between the skulls and the broader landscape of unexplained artifacts and anomalous objects. The crystal skulls are not the only objects that have been claimed to be evidence of lost civilizations, advanced ancient technology, or extraterrestrial intervention. They exist within a larger constellation of mysterious artifacts that have fueled speculation and debate for decades. The Antikythera mechanism, a bronze device found in a shipwreck off the coast of Greece, dating to the 2nd century before the Common Era, that appears to be an analog computer for predicting astronomical events. The Baghdad batteries, clay jars containing copper and iron components that some researchers have interpreted as primitive galvanic cells. The Nazca lines, enormous geoglyphs etched into the desert floor of Peru, visible only from the air. The Piri Reis map, a 16th century Ottoman map that appears to show the coastline of Antarctica before it was covered by ice. The Voynich manuscript, a medieval document written in an unknown script and filled with illustrations of unidentified plants. Each of these objects, like the crystal skulls, has inspired a range of interpretations, from the conventionally scientific to the wildly speculative. And each of them, like the crystal skulls, exists at the boundary between the known and the unknown, inviting us to question our assumptions about the past and about the limits of human ingenuity. The crystal skulls fit comfortably into this landscape of anomaly. They are objects that seem to defy easy categorization. They are too sophisticated to be dismissed as crude forgeries. They are too poorly documented to be accepted as genuine artifacts. They are too beautiful to be ignored. And they are too mysterious to be forgotten. They occupy a liminal space, a space between certainty and doubt, between knowledge and wonder. That is, for many people, the most interesting space of all. Let us now return to the question of dating, because the age of the crystal skulls, or more precisely, the inability to determine their age, is one of the central challenges in the crystal skull debate. Dating stone objects is notoriously difficult. The most widely used dating methods in archaeology, radiocarbon dating, thermoluminescence dating, dendrochronology, are not directly applicable to quartz crystal. Radiocarbon dating works only on organic materials, wood, bone, charcoal, textile. Thermoluminescence dating works on materials that have been heated, pottery, burnt flint. Dendrochronology works on wood. None of these methods can be used to date a piece of quartz crystal. There are some analytical methods that can provide indirect information about a crystal skull's age. Surface analysis can reveal tool marks that are characteristic of specific time periods and technologies. Chemical analysis can detect residues, traces of polishing compounds, adhesives, or other materials that might be linked to specific manufacturing processes. And isotopic analysis of the quartz itself can, in some cases, help determine the geological origin of the crystal, the specific quarry or deposit from which it was mined, which might, in turn, help narrow down the date and location of manufacture. But none of these methods can provide the kind of precise, definitive date that a radiocarbon date provides for an organic object. The best that science can do in most cases is to determine whether a crystal skull was carved with modern or pre-modern tools. If modern tool marks are found, the skull is almost certainly a modern creation. If no modern tool marks are found, the skull might be ancient, but it might also be a modern creation made with deliberately archaic techniques. The absence of modern tool marks is suggestive but not conclusive. This limitation is frustrating for everyone involved in the debate. Scientists want definitive answers, believers want vindication, skeptics want closure, and the crystal skulls sitting in their cases with their empty eyes and their luminous silence offer none of these things. They are, as they have always been, ambiguous, and perhaps that is the point. Let us now consider the legend of the 13 skulls in more detail. Because this legend, whatever its origin, has become one of the most powerful and enduring narratives in the crystal skull phenomenon, and it deserves careful examination. The legend, as it is commonly told, goes something like this. In the distant past, an advanced civilization, sometimes identified as the Maya, sometimes as the Atlanteans, sometimes as an unnamed race of beings, created 13 life-sized crystal skulls. These skulls were repositories of knowledge and wisdom. They contain the accumulated understanding of the civilization that created them, knowledge of science, medicine, history, spirituality, and the fundamental nature of the universe. The 13 skulls were distributed across the world, entrusted to different peoples and hidden in different locations. One day, when the time is right, the 13 skulls will be brought together. When they are assembled in one place, they will reveal their secrets. They will unlock hidden knowledge that will transform human civilization. They will usher in a new age of peace, understanding, and spiritual evolution. This legend has been embellished and elaborated in countless ways by different authors, speakers, and communities. Some versions specify that the skulls must be assembled by a certain date. The end of the Maya long count calendar in December 2012 was a popular deadline for many years. Some versions describe specific properties of each skull. One controls healing, another controls knowledge, another controls time. Some versions describe the skulls as being guarded by secret societies or indigenous elders who are waiting for a sign that the time has come to bring them together. The legend is compelling. It has the structure of a classic mythological quest, the search for scattered sacred objects that must be united to save the world. It has echoes of the Holy Grail, of the Ark of the Covenant, of the Philosopher's Stone. It taps into deep archetypal patterns that resonate across cultures and across time. But where does the legend come from? As we discussed in Part 1, there is no known pre-Columbian source for the legend of the 13 skulls. It does not appear in any Maya or Aztec codex, inscription, or documented oral tradition. The earliest known versions of the legend date from the 1980s, when they were popularized by crystal skull authors and New Age speakers. Some of these authors claim to have received the legend from indigenous elders, but the specific elders, the specific communities, and the specific circumstances of transmission are almost never documented, making it impossible to verify these claims. This does not necessarily mean that the legend is a modern invention. It is possible that it is based on a genuine indigenous oral tradition that was never written down and that has been transmitted informally, outside the view of academic researchers. Indigenous oral traditions are, by their nature, difficult to document. They are passed from person to person, generation to generation, in contexts that are often private, sacred, and deliberately hidden from outsiders. It is entirely conceivable that a tradition about crystal skulls, or about sacred objects more generally, exists in some indigenous community and has not been recorded by Western scholars. But it is also possible, and, in the view of most scholars, more probable, that the legend of the 13 skulls is a modern creation. It may have been inspired by genuine indigenous traditions about crystal and about skulls, but it was assembled, elaborated, and popularized by non-indigenous authors writing for a non-indigenous audience. It is, in this view, a myth about Mesoamerica rather than a myth from Mesoamerica, a story that tells us more about the hopes and fears of modern people than about the beliefs of ancient ones. Whether the legend is ancient or modern, it has had a profound impact on the crystal skull phenomenon. It has provided a narrative framework, a story, that gives the individual skulls meaning and purpose. It has inspired people to search for crystal skulls, to study them, to collect them, and to bring them together. It has fueled conferences, books, documentaries, and online communities. And it has given the crystal skull phenomenon a sense of urgency and significance that it might not otherwise have. The legend of the 13 skulls transforms the crystal skulls from mere curiosities into participants in a cosmic drama. And that transformation has ensured that the crystal skulls will remain objects of fascination for years to come. Let us now turn to the Maya calendar and its relationship to the crystal skull phenomenon. Because the Maya calendar, one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of any civilization, has been deeply intertwined with crystal skull lore, especially in the years leading up to December 21, 2012. The Maya developed several interlocking calendar systems, the most important of which were the Tzolk'in, a 260-day ritual calendar, the Hab, a 365-day solar calendar, and the Long Count, a linear calendar that tracked elapsed time from a mythological creation date. The Long Count calendar was organized in cycles of increasing length, kins, days, Uinals 20-day periods, Tuns 360-day periods, Katuns 7,200-day periods, and Baktuns 144,000-day periods. The current era of the Long Count calendar, the era that began on the Maya creation date, which correlates to August 11, 3114 BCE in the Gregorian calendar, was divided into 13 Baktuns. The 13th Baktun ended on December 21, 2012. This date was seized upon by a wide range of writers, speakers, and communities as a time of cosmic significance. Some predicted that it would mark the end of the world. Others predicted that it would mark the beginning of a new era of enlightenment and spiritual evolution. And many crystal skull enthusiasts linked their skulls to the 2012 date, claiming that the crystal skulls were created to be activated or assembled at the end of the 13th Baktun, that they were, in effect, spiritual time capsules designed to be opened at the moment of cosmic transition. December 21, 2012 came and went without any discernible cosmic event. The world did not end, no new age dawned, no crystal skulls were activated. The predictions, like virtually all apocalyptic predictions throughout history, proved to be wrong. And the crystal skull community, like the broader 2012 community, quietly moved on, adjusting its narratives and its timelines to accommodate the non-event. But the association between the crystal skulls and the Maya calendar reveals something important about how ancient knowledge is appropriated and repurposed by modern movements. The Maya calendar is a genuine and remarkable intellectual achievement. It reflects a deep understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and the cyclical nature of time. But the interpretations imposed upon it by 2012 enthusiasts, the predictions of apocalypse, the promises of transcendence, have no basis in Maya culture or Maya thought. The Maya themselves did not predict the end of the world in 2012. They did not associate the end of the 13th Baktun with cosmic destruction or spiritual transformation. The 13th Bakdun was simply the end of a cycle, a significant event, certainly, but no more apocalyptic than the turning of a millennium in the Western calendar. The appropriation of the Maya calendar by crystal skull enthusiasts follows the same pattern as the appropriation of Maya culture more broadly. Genuine elements of Maya thought, the calendar, the cosmology, the symbolism, are taken out of context, mixed with modern ideas and New Age concepts, and presented as ancient wisdom. The result is a hybrid mythology that is neither genuinely ancient nor genuinely modern, a mythology that uses the prestige of the ancient to validate the aspirations of the present. This is not necessarily a bad thing. All cultures borrow from other cultures. All mythologies evolve and change over time. And the fascination with the Maya that drives the crystal skull phenomenon is, at its heart, a form of respect, a recognition that the Maya were extraordinary people who achieved extraordinary things. But it is important to distinguish between what the Maya actually believed and what modern enthusiasts say they believed. And it is important to let the Maya speak for themselves, rather than putting words in their mouths. Now let us consider the future of the crystal skull phenomenon. What will become of these objects? What new discoveries or analyses might shed light on their origins? And what role will they continue to play in our cultural imagination? The scientific study of the crystal skulls is far from over. New analytical techniques are being developed all the time, and some of these techniques may eventually be applied to the skulls. One promising avenue of research is surface residue analysis, which involves examining the microscopic traces of material that accumulate on an object's surface over time. Pollen grains, mineral particles, organic residues, and other microscopic materials can become trapped in the surface irregularities of a crystal skull, and their analysis might provide clues about the skull's history, where it has been, how it has been handled, and potentially how old it is. Another promising technique is laser ablation mass spectrometry, which can determine the chemical composition of a material at extremely fine resolution. By analyzing the trace elements in the quartz crystal of a skull, researchers might be able to determine the geological origin of the crystal, the specific deposit or region from which it was mined. This in turn might help establish whether the crystal came from a source that was accessible to pre-Columbian Mesoamericans or from a source, such as Brazil, that would point to a post-Columbian origin. And there is always the possibility that a life-sized crystal skull will be found in a controlled archaeological excavation, a discovery that would transform the debate overnight. Such a discovery has not yet occurred, and most professional archaeologists consider it unlikely. But archaeology is a field of surprises. Objects that were once considered mythological, the city of Troy, the tomb of Tutankhamun, the terracotta warriors of Qin Shi Huang, have been found by archaeologists who were willing to look where others said there was nothing to find. A crystal skull found in situ, in a documented stratigraphic context, with associated artifacts that could be independently dated, such a find would be a game changer. It would provide definitive evidence that at least one crystal skull is genuinely ancient, and it would force a complete reevaluation of the crystal skull phenomenon. Until that day comes, if it ever comes, the crystal skulls will remain what they have always been: objects of beauty, objects of mystery, objects of controversy. They will continue to be displayed in museums, where they will be viewed by millions of visitors who will be simultaneously awed and puzzled. They will continue to be studied by scientists who will bring ever more sophisticated tools to bear on the question of their origin. They will continue to be venerated by believers who will find in them a source of spiritual comfort and meaning, and they will continue to be debated by skeptics and enthusiasts, by scientists and mystics, by rationalists and romantics, as they have been debated for over a century. Let us now, as we approach the conclusion of our journey, take one final look at the crystal skulls in the broadest possible perspective. The crystal skulls are, in the end, about time. They are about our relationship with time, with the past, the present, and the future. They are about the deep human need to connect with what has gone before, to touch the past, to hold it in our hands, to feel its weight and its texture and its meaning. They are about the even deeper human need to believe that the past has something to teach us, that the wisdom of the ancients, if we could only access it, would illuminate our present and guide our future. This need is universal. It is not specific to crystal skull enthusiasts or New Age practitioners. It is felt by scientists who spend their careers excavating ancient cities. It is felt by historians who spend their lives reading ancient texts. It is felt by ordinary people who visit museums, read historical novels, watch documentaries, and wonder what the world was like before they were born. We are all, in our own ways, seekers of the past, and the crystal skulls, whatever their origin, speak to this seeking. The crystal skulls are also about mystery. They remind us that for all our scientific knowledge, for all our technological prowess, for all our ability to analyze, categorize, and explain, there are still things in the world that resist easy explanation. The crystal skulls may eventually be fully explained, every one of them traced to a specific workshop, a specific craftsman, a specific date, or they may not. There may always be a residue of mystery, a corner of uncertainty, a shadow that no amount of light can fully dispel. And this residue of mystery is, paradoxically, one of the most valuable things about the crystal skulls, because mystery is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be embraced. It is the engine of curiosity, the mother of exploration, the spark that ignites the scientific enterprise itself. Without mystery, there is no motivation to inquire. Without unanswered questions, there is no reason to seek answers. The crystal skulls, by refusing to yield their secrets completely, keep us asking, keep us searching, keep us wondering. And the crystal skulls are about beauty. This is perhaps the simplest and most profound thing about them. Whatever their origin, whether they were carved by Maya priests in sacred temples or by German craftsmen in commercial workshops, they are extraordinarily beautiful objects. The play of light through crystal, the luminous transparency of polished quartz. The haunting perfection of a human skull rendered in the purest, most brilliant stone on earth. These things speak for themselves. They do not need provenance or authentication or scientific analysis to justify their existence. They are beautiful, and beauty, like mystery, is its own justification. As we conclude this exploration, let us remember the civilizations that stand behind the crystal skulls, whether as their creators or as the cultural context that gives them meaning. Maya, who mapped the stars and calculated the movements of planets with a precision that still astonishes. The Aztecs, who built a capital that rivaled any city on Earth, and who believed that the very survival of the sun depended on human devotion. The Olmec, who carved colossal stone heads in the steaming jungles of the Gulf Coast. The Mixtec, whose goldwork was so exquisite that the Spanish conquistadors melted it down for bullion, destroying masterpieces of art to fill their treasure chests. The Zapotec, who built their city on a mountaintop and developed a writing system that may be the oldest in the Western Hemisphere. These civilizations were real. Their achievements were genuine. Their legacy is not a matter of speculation or debate. It is carved in stone, painted on walls, written in glyphs, and woven into the living fabric of the indigenous communities that carry their traditions forward into the present day. The crystal skulls, if they are genuine, are a testament to the genius of these civilizations. And if they are not genuine, if they are 19th century creations, products of European workshops and Victorian-era fraud, they are still, in a strange way, a testament. A testament to the power of Mesoamerican culture to captivate, to inspire, to enchant. A testament to the fact that even when the temples were destroyed, the codices burned, the languages suppressed, and the people subjugated, the spirit of Mesoamerican civilization could not be extinguished. It lived on in the imagination of the world. It lived on in the fascination that Europeans and others felt for the art, the architecture, the cosmology, and the mystery of the Maya and the Aztecs. And it lived on, perhaps, in the luminous depths of crystal skulls that may or may not have been carved by the people whose culture they evoke. The crystal skulls are paradoxes in stone. They are objects that may be ancient or modern, sacred or profane, genuine or fake. They are objects that inspire devotion and derision, wonder and skepticism, reverence and ridicule. They are objects that have been studied by scientists with electron microscopes and venerated by believers with candles and incense. They are objects that have been displayed in the world's greatest museums and hidden in private collections. They are objects that have been the subject of peer-reviewed scientific papers and New Age bestsellers, documentary films and tabloid headlines, academic conferences and psychic readings. And through all of this, through all the analysis and speculation, through all the claims and counterclaims, through all the believing and debunking, the crystal skulls remain what they have always been: silent, luminous. Patient, inscrutable, they do not defend themselves against the charge of fraud. They do not confirm the hopes of believers. They do not reveal their secrets to scientists. They do not answer questions. They simply sit and glow and wait. Wait for what? Perhaps for the day when someone asks the right question. Perhaps for the day when someone develops the right test. Perhaps for the day when another skull is found in another ruin in another jungle and the whole conversation begins again. Or perhaps for nothing at all. Perhaps the crystal skulls are not waiting. Perhaps they are simply being beautiful, being mysterious, being crystal, being skulls, and perhaps that is enough. We began this journey in the jungle, in the thick, wet, living air of the tropical forest. Beneath the canopy, where the light filters green through a million leaves, where the roots of great trees grip the earth like the fingers of giants, where the ruins of forgotten cities crumble slowly back into the soil from which they rose. We began with a question: what are the crystal skulls? And we end with the same question because the question has no definitive answer. Not yet, perhaps not ever, but we are richer for having asked it. We are richer for having walked through the jungles and the museums, the workshops and the auction houses, the laboratories and the temples. We are richer for having listened to the scientists and the believers, the skeptics and the dreamers, the historians and the shamans. We are richer for having gazed into the empty, luminous eyes of a crystal skull and felt, even for a moment, the thrill of the unknown. The crystal skulls of Mesoamerica, objects of beauty, objects of terror, objects of devotion. Objects of deception, objects that have fascinated the world for more than a century and that will continue to fascinate it for centuries to come. They are made of quartz, silicon dioxide, the stuff of sand and stone and the circuitry of computers. They are made of legend, stories told and retold, embellished and transformed, believed and doubted across generations. And they are made of us, of our hopes, our fears, our longing for the past, our hunger for the future, our need to believe that the world is more wonderful and more mysterious than we have yet imagined. The jungle is thick, the air is heavy, the ruins are silent, and somewhere in a museum case or a private collection, in a locked vault or a hidden cave, a crystal skull is watching. Its eyes glow with an inner light. Its jaw hangs slightly open as if it is about to speak, but it does not speak. It never speaks, it only waits, and we, the watchers, wait with it for the next discovery, for the next analysis, for the next revelation, for the truth, whatever the truth may be, to emerge from the depths of crystal, from the depths of time, from the depths of the human heart. The crystal skulls of Mesoamerica, a mystery that endures, a mystery that may never be solved. A mystery that reminds us in its beautiful and terrible silence that we are small, that the world is vast, that time is deep, and that the past is never truly past. It is only waiting to be found. This concludes our exploration of the crystal skulls of Mesoamerica. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of history's most enduring and fascinating mysteries.